Clara Whitmore knelt behind the livery stable, prying her last 11 cents from the seam of her own boot. 3 weeks earlier, she had buried her mother on the trail, no stone to mark the grave. Now a stranger's 10-year-old son stood watching her count pennies like his family's future hung on the answer. Before this story ends, a broken widower will look a penniless orphan in the eye and say 5 words that change 4 lives forever. If you're watching from your porch, your kitchen, your favorite chair, tell me your city below, and subscribe because you will not want to miss where this goes. Colorado Territory. Summer, 1885. Clara Whitmore had exactly 11 cents left in the world, and she was counting them for the 3rd time, as though the coins might multiply if she stared hard enough. They didn't. She closed her fist around them anyway, pressed her knuckles white, and looked up at the woman standing over her with a ledger book clutched to her chest like a weapon. "I'm not asking you twice, Miss Whitmore." Mrs. Pruitt's voice carried across the boardwalk, sharp enough that 2 men loading a wagon nearby stopped to listen. "You owe me for 4 nights. 4 nights of a room, 4 nights of meals, and I have exactly 11 cents worth of patience left for a girl who can't pay her way. I can work it off." Clara stood smoothing the front of a dress that had been mended so many times, the thread showed more than the fabric. "I can clean. I can cook. I can mend linens faster than anyone you've hired. I don't need a seamstress. I need rent." Mrs. Pruitt snapped the ledger shut. "This is a hotel, not an orphanage." The word landed like a slap. Clara's chin lifted anyway. "I'm not an orphan asking for charity, ma'am. I'm a woman asking for work. You're a woman with 11 cents and no husband, no family, and no letter of reference. Around here, that's called trouble, and I've got no room for trouble past sundown." A small voice cut through the exchange before Clara could answer. "Why are you sitting there like you're waiting to disappear?" Clara turned. A boy stood a few feet away, maybe 10 years old. Hat pushed back off his forehead, staring at her with the kind of directness only children seem to manage. Behind him, a man had gone still in the middle of the street, one hand still on the neck of a bay horse watching. "Henry." The man's voice was low, almost a warning. "Get back here." The boy didn't move. "She's not waiting to disappear, Papa. She's waiting for somebody to say something decent." Mrs. Pruitt sniffed. "Samuel Carter, you keep that boy of yours from meddling in hotel business." "He's not meddling." Samuel led the horse forward slow, like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. He didn't look at Clara directly. He looked at Mrs. Pruitt, and something in his jaw tightened. "How much does she owe?" "That's not your concern." "I'm making it my concern. How much?" Mrs. Pruitt hesitated, clearly unhappy about it, then named a figure. Samuel reached into his coat, counted out the coins without ceremony, and set them in her palm. "There. Paid in full." "Samuel?" Clara started mortified, but he was already turning away, already reaching for his horse's reins, like the matter was settled and didn't require further discussion. "I don't need charity," she said louder than she meant to. That stopped him. He looked at her then properly for the first time. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "It isn't charity, Miss Whitmore. Clara Whitmore. Miss Whitmore. It's $4. I've spent more on a bad horse." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Clara opened her mouth and found she didn't have a ready answer. The point was that she had nothing, and a stranger had just seen it, and pride was the only thing she had left that hadn't been spent or stolen or buried along the trail with her mother 3 weeks back. She wasn't about to explain any of that to a man she'd known for 90 seconds. "The point is, I don't take money from men I don't know. Then get to know me." He said it flatly, without any charm behind it, like a man stating a fact rather than making an offer. "Samuel Carter. I run cattle 6 miles north of town. That's Henry, my son. Somewhere behind him is my daughter, who's supposed to be minding the wagon." A small girl peeked out from behind a barrel near the wagon, no older than 6, clutching a rag doll with one button eye. She didn't say anything. She just watched Clara with the same unsettling focus her brother had. "That's Molly," Samuel said. "She talks when she wants to, which isn't often. Mrs. Pruitt cleared her throat pointedly. If you're all quite finished conducting business on my boardwalk, we're finished. Samuel tipped his hat, the first gesture that resembled manners since he'd arrived. Miss Whitmore, good day. He started to walk the horse toward the wagon. Henry didn't follow. Papa, you can't just leave her here. She's a grown woman, Henry. She'll manage. She doesn't have anywhere to go. I heard Mrs. Pruitt say she doesn't have family. Samuel stopped. Clara watched his shoulders rise and fall with one long breath, the kind a man takes when he's about to do something he'd rather not. Henry, you always say a person's not supposed to walk past trouble if they can fix it. You said that about the Hendersons' fence. You said that about the Miller's barn. That's different. How is it different? Samuel didn't answer right away. Clara felt heat climb up her neck, half from embarrassment, half from something else she couldn't name yet, the strange sensation of being discussed, as though she were a fence that needed mending. It's different, Samuel finally said, because a fence doesn't have opinions about being fixed. I have opinions, Clara said. Several. Right now, the loudest one is that I'd rather not be talked about like I'm not standing here. That earned her the faintest twitch at the corner of Samuel's mouth, not quite a smile, a ghost of one gone as fast as it came. Fair enough, Miss Whitmore. What would you have me do? Nothing. I don't need rescuing. You needed $4 10 minutes ago. That was a loan. I intend to pay it back. With what? The question wasn't cruel. It was just honest, and honesty from a stranger stung worse than cruelty would have. Clara looked down at her hands at the 11 cents still pressed into her palm, and found she had no answer that didn't sound like begging. With work, she said finally. I can cook, I can sew. I can keep a house running better than most women twice my age, and I intend to prove it to the first person in this town willing to give me the chance. I've got a house that needs running. Samuel said it plainly, like he was commenting on the weather. Then, as if hearing himself, he added, I'm not saying that the way it sounds. How does it sound? Like something it isn't. Henry snorted. Even Molly from behind her barrel made a small sound that might have been a laugh. I need someone to cook, clean, and mind the children while I work the herd, Samuel said. I'll pay a fair wage, room and board included. It's honest work, Miss Whitmore, nothing more. Clara studied him. There was no warmth in the offer, no softness, nothing that resembled the kind of interest a man might show a woman he found pleasing to look at. It was a business proposal delivered with all the romance of a cattle sale, and something about that steadied her more than any flattery could have. Why me? She asked. You don't know me. I know you stood up to Ada Pruitt without flinching, and I know my son decided you were worth defending inside of 2 minutes of meeting you. That's more than most folks manage in this town in a year. Papa doesn't give compliments, Henry said solemnly. That was basically a proposal of marriage. Henry, I'm just saying. Get in the wagon. Henry grinned and obeyed, hauling himself up onto the seat with the satisfaction of a boy who'd won an argument he hadn't technically been part of. Molly slipped out from behind the barrel and climbed up beside him without a word, still watching Clara over her shoulder. Clara stood there with 11 cents in her hand and a stranger's job offer hanging in the summer air, and she understood with the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose that this was the only door standing open to her in the whole of Twin Rivers. I'll need to think on it, she said. Take the afternoon. Samuel swung up onto his horse. I'll be back through town before supper. If you're still here, I'll take that as your answer. And if I'm not, then I'll know you found something better, and I'll wish you well. He rode off without waiting for a response, the wagon creaking along behind him, with his 2 children craning their necks to watch her until the road curved and took them out of sight. Mrs. Pruitt, who had been listening to the entire exchange with poorly concealed interest, made a small noise of disapproval. Samuel Carter hasn't said that many words together since his wife passed. 2 years of silence, and here he is, offering employment to a girl fresh off the stage. How did she die? Clara asked before she could stop herself. Fever, same as half of the county lost that winter. Left him with 2 children and a ranch he can barely keep standing. Man used to talk your ear off before Sarah Carter died. Now you're lucky to get 3 words out of him at the mercantile. Mrs. Pruitt studied Clara with new appraisal. You'd be a fool to go out there. Broken men don't fix themselves just because a pretty woman starts cooking their supper. I didn't ask for your opinion. No, but you're going to get it anyway because somebody ought to warn you. Mrs. Pruitt lowered her voice, glancing up and down the street as if the words were valuable enough to steal. There's a man in this town, Edward Mallory, owns the mercantile and half the buildings on this street besides. Widower himself, no children to complicate things, respectable, comfortable. He's been asking after unmarried women new to town. A girl in your position could do considerably better than Samuel Carter's ranch. I haven't asked to do better. I've asked to eat. Suit yourself. Mrs. Pruitt turned to go, then paused. For what it's worth, the boy's right about one thing. Samuel Carter is a good man underneath all that silence. Just don't mistake good for whole. Those aren't the same thing, and a woman with no family of her own can't afford to learn the difference the hard way. She walked off, leaving Clara alone on the boardwalk, with the sun beating down and 11 cents growing warm in her palm. Clara spent the rest of the morning walking the length of Twin Rivers, twice, knocking on the doors of every business that might conceivably need a woman's hands. The dressmaker already had an assistant. The boarding house wasn't hiring. The diner's owner looked her up and down and said not unkindly that he couldn't afford to feed another mouth even if that mouth came attached to willing hands. Outside the church, a woman in a gray bonnet stopped her before she could pass, one hand closing around Clara's wrist with more familiarity than the moment warranted. You're the girl who came off yesterday's stage. I am. Alone. Yes, ma'am. No husband, no father, no brother to speak for you. The woman said it like a diagnosis, not a question. That's a dangerous way to arrive in a town this size, Miss Whitmore. Miss Whitmore. Folks talk. Folks will talk about you whether you give them cause or not, so you'd best make certain you give them as little cause as possible. A woman alone draws attention, and attention in a town this small has a way of turning into judgment before supper's even served. I appreciate the warning. It's not a warning, it's arithmetic. You've got no family, no money, and no history anybody here can vouch for. That leaves you 2 kinds of position available to you, and only 2. Respectable work under a roof somebody trusts, or the kind of arrangement decent women don't discuss on church steps. I'd advise you toward the first, and quickly before the town decides for you which kind you are. The woman released her wrist and walked on without waiting for a response, leaving Clara standing there with the sun climbing higher and the weight of the morning pressing down harder than it had an hour before. By the third establishment after that, a general sense of the town's opinion had crystallized. A woman alone with no family, no letters, and no history anyone in Twin Rivers could vouch for was a liability nobody wanted to take a chance on. She stopped in front of the mercantile, last staring at the gold lettering on the window. Mallory's Dry Goods, and considered briefly walking inside. The door opened before she could decide. A man stepped out, tall, well-dressed hair, combed with more care than any rancher would bother with. He looked at her the way a man looks at merchandise he's already decided he wants. You must be the young woman everyone's talking about. I wasn't aware I was a topic of conversation. Twin Rivers is a small town, Miss Whitmore. Edward Mallory. He extended a hand she didn't take, and after a moment he lowered it without apparent offense. I understand you're in need of a position. I'm in need of many things. A position is one of them. I could use help in the store. Bookkeeping mostly. Respectable work, respectable hours. He smiled, and it was a pleasant enough smile, practiced and even. I could also offer considerably more than a position in time if you found yourself amenable to it. Clara understood exactly what he meant, and the bluntness of it dressed up in politeness, though it was turned her stomach in a way Samuel Carter's plain business offer never had. I appreciate your candor, Mr. Mallory. I'll consider the bookkeeping. And the rest. I said I'd consider the bookkeeping. His smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes cooled by several degrees. Of course. Take your time, Miss Whitmore. Twin Rivers isn't going anywhere, And neither I suspect are you. Not with 11 cents and no family to send for. How did you know how much money I have? Small town. He tipped his hat, mirroring the gesture Samuel had made hours earlier, though it carried none of the same weight. I'll be here when you've finished considering. He went back inside. Clara stood on the street a long moment, the heat pressing down on her shoulders like a hand, and thought about her mother, 3 weeks buried now, somewhere along the trail behind her in ground that would never have a marker, because there hadn't been time or money for one. She thought about the wagon train that had scattered after the fever took a dozen of them, about the family she used to have reduced now to 11 cents, and a decision she didn't want to make. She sat down on the steps of the hotel again, because there was nowhere else to sit, and because some part of her, the stubborn part, the part her mother used to call bullheaded, with something like pride in her voice, refused to walk into Edward Mallory's store and accept an arrangement dressed up as employment. The afternoon crawled forward. Clara watched the town go about its business, watched women she didn't know carry baskets and children, and conversation passed her without a second glance, and felt for the first time since her mother's death entirely and completely alone. It was nearly 5 o'clock when the wagon came back into view, Samuel Carter driving his children, flanking him on the bench seat. He pulled up outside the hotel and didn't get down, just looked at her, sitting there in the same spot she'd occupied all afternoon. You're still here. I'm still here. Does that mean you've decided, or does that mean you haven't found anywhere better to sit? Maybe both. Henry leaned forward eagerly. Does that mean yes? Henry. I'm just asking. Clara stood brushing the dust from her skirt and made herself meet Samuel's eyes, even though every instinct told her it would be easier to look away. I have conditions. I'm listening. I work for wages, same as any hired hand. I don't want charity, and I don't want anyone in this town thinking I'm anything other than an employee in your house. Agreed. I keep my own room with a lock on the door. There's a room off the kitchen that stood empty since my sister left 2 winters back. It's got a lock. I'll have Henry fetch you a key tonight if you need convincing. I don't need convincing. I need it to be true. It's true. And if this doesn't work, if I'm not suited to your household, or you're not suited to having me in it, I want your word you'll help me find another position before you send me off. Samuel studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, some weight settling differently across his shoulders. You've got my word, Miss Whitmore. I don't break it once it's given. Ask anyone in this town. I don't know anyone in this town. Then ask my children. They'll tell you plain enough they don't know how to be anything but honest. God help me. Molly, who had said nothing all day, finally spoke, her voice small but clear. Are you coming home with us? The word home landed somewhere in Clara's chest and stayed there aching in a way she didn't have time to examine. If your papa still wants me to, yes. I still want you to, Samuel said, and there was no hesitation in it at all. Clara climbed up onto the wagon bench beside Henry, who scooted over to make room with obvious delight, and Samuel clicked his tongue at the horses and set them moving north out of town. Nobody spoke for the first mile. The silence wasn't uncomfortable so much as unfamiliar, the kind of quiet that comes from 4 strangers, deciding without quite saying so to become something else to each other. The wagon hit a deep rut without warning, and the whole frame lurched hard to one side. Molly slid across the bench with a startled cry, and Clara's arm shot out on instinct, catching the girl around the waist before she could tumble against the side rail. Samuel hauled back on the reins, bringing the horses up short. Molly, you hurt. I'm all right. Molly's voice wobbled, but she righted herself in Clara's grip, small fingers curling around Clara's sleeve a moment longer than necessary. You caught me. Course I caught you. Clara kept her arm steady until she was certain the girl had her balance back. Nobody's falling out of this wagon on my watch. Samuel twisted around on the bench, checking the girl over with quick, practiced eyes, the look of a father who'd learned the hard way not to trust that a child's own report of being fine was the whole truth of it. Satisfied, he turned back to the road, but something in his posture had loosened, some tension gone out of his shoulders that Clara hadn't noticed carrying weight until it left. Front wheel caught the rut, he said mostly to himself. I've been meaning to fill that in for a month. You've been meaning to fill in a lot of things for a month, I'd wager. That obvious. A man who runs a ranch alone with 2 children and no wife has a list longer than his arm and a day shorter than the list requires. That's not an insult, Mr. Carter. That's just how the arithmetic works. Samuel let out something that was almost a laugh, low and rusty, like a sound his throat hadn't practiced in some time. You talk like Ada Pruitt, all arithmetic and plain speaking. I'll take that as a compliment, since I doubt you meant it as one. Take it however suits you. He clicked his tongue at the horses and got them moving again, slower this time, mindful of the road. Henry, keep an eye out for the next rut. I'd rather not explain to Miss Whitmore on her first evening why she ought never to have climbed up on this wagon. Yes, sir. Miss Whitmore, Henry said eventually. Can you cook biscuits? Papa's biscuits could stop a bullet. I heard that, Samuel said without turning around. I meant you to. I can cook biscuits, Clara said, and for the first time since her mother died, something that resembled a smile found its way onto her face. Good ones. My mother taught me. Where's your mother? Molly asked with the blunt curiosity only a 6-year-old could get away with. The wagon jolted over a rut in the road, and Clara used the moment to compose herself before answering. She passed, not long ago, on the trail coming west. Our mother passed too. Molly said, matter of fact, no cruelty in it, just the plain sharing of a fact between 2 people who understood the same kind of loss. Papa doesn't talk about her much. Molly. It's true, Papa. Samuel's jaw tightened, and for a moment Clara thought he might say something sharp, but instead he let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for longer than the moment required. Her name was Sarah, he said, quiet eyes fixed on the road ahead. She died 2 winters back. Fever took her in 4 days. I don't talk about her because there isn't a version of talking about her that doesn't end with me remembering exactly how useless I was while it happened. Nobody spoke after that. Clara understood with the sudden clarity of shared grief that she had just been handed something fragile and true, something Samuel Carter didn't offer easily or often, and she didn't reach for it further. She let it sit there in the wagon bed between them, acknowledged and untouched the way you'd treat any wound too fresh for prodding. The ranch came into view as the sun dropped low and orange over the western hills, a house that had clearly once been well kept and had since fallen into the particular disrepair of a home, missing a woman's hand, a barn leaning slightly to one side, fences patched with mismatched wood in a dozen places. Clara took it in without comment, cataloging the work that needed doing, the way she'd cataloged every household chore since she was old enough to hold a broom. It's not much, Samuel said, apparently reading something in her silence. I know that. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. I was thinking the fence needs mending before winter and that garden plot's been let go to seed, and somebody ought to whitewash that porch before it rots clean through. I wasn't thinking. It's not much. I was thinking there's a great deal of work here, and I intend to be useful. Something in Samuel's face eased just slightly, the tightness around his eyes loosening by a fraction. Most folks who see this place for the first time say something about how far it is from town, or how run down it's gotten. Nobody's looked at it and started making a list of chores. I've never had the luxury of looking at anything and not making a list of chores. It's how I was raised. Then you'll fit in fine around here. Making lists of chores is more or less the family business. Henry laughed at that, a real laugh, and Molly finally let go of her doll long enough to point out the chicken coop, the well, the tree she liked to climb when her father wasn't watching closely enough to stop her. By the time the wagon rolled to a stop in the yard, the strangeness of the day had settled into something quieter, something that felt against all reasonable expectation, almost like the beginning of an arrangement that might hold. Samuel helped her down from the wagon, his hand brief and businesslike around hers, nothing lingering in the touch at all. He showed her the room off the kitchen, small plain, clean enough with a narrow bed, and a window that looked out over the garden plot she'd already mentally begun repairing, and left her to settle in while he saw to the horses. It was over supper plain, but filling that the question came that Clara hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for. Henry and Molly had gone to bed worn out from the day, and Samuel sat across the table from her in the lamplight, turning a coffee cup slowly between his hands. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honest because I don't have the patience left in me for polite lies." "Ask then. Why'd you come west? Most folks who make that trip have family waiting on the other end. Somebody sent for them, or somebody's meeting them, or there's land already claimed with their name on the deed. You came into Twin Rivers with 11 cents, and no letter of reference, and no family anybody in that town could name. That's not a story. That's a woman running from something, or a woman who's got nothing left to run toward." Clara set down her fork. The lamplight flickered between them, and outside the window, the last of the summer evening bled slowly out of the sky. "My mother and I came west after my father died. Consumption 3 years back. We had a little money, not much, and a cousin in California who'd written asking us to come help run his store. We joined a wagon train out of Missouri in the spring." She paused, and Samuel didn't fill the silence, just waited patient in a way that surprised her. "Fever took a dozen people on that trail before we reached the Colorado line. My mother among them. I buried her myself with 2 other families, helping dig in ground that doesn't have so much as a marker to show for it. By the time we reached Twin Rivers, the wagon train was scattering in every direction, folks heading their separate ways, and I didn't have money enough left to continue on to California, and I didn't have a way to write ahead to my cousin to explain what had happened. I have no family left, Mr. Carter. None. Not a cousin who knows I'm alive. Not a friend who'd recognize my name. Not a single soul in this territory who'd notice if I disappeared tomorrow. That's the whole of it. That's why I came into your town with 11 cents and no letter of reference. I didn't run from anything. I just ran out of everything." The kitchen was very quiet. Samuel set his coffee cup down with great care, as though the sound of it touching the table might break something. "I'm sorry," he said. "For your mother. For all of it. I don't need sympathy, Mr. Carter. I've had enough of it from strangers today to last a lifetime. It's not sympathy." He looked at her directly, and there was nothing performed in it, nothing soft or careful about the way he said what came next. "Funny. My children need a mother." Clara went very still. "I don't mean that the way it sounds," Samuel said quickly, some color rising in his face, the most emotion she'd seen from him all day. I don't mean to propose anything or suggest anything improper. I mean it plain. Henry hasn't laughed like he did tonight in longer than I can remember. Molly hasn't spoken more than a dozen words to a stranger in 2 years, and she asked you outright if you were coming home with us. I've watched my children go quiet and careful since their mother died the same as I did, and in one afternoon, you've undone some part of that without even trying. I don't know what to make of it, and I don't know what to make of you, but I know what I saw at my supper table tonight, and I haven't seen it in 2 years. Clara's throat tightened, and she was grateful for the dim lamplight, grateful it might hide whatever her face was doing. "I have no family left," she said again, quieter this time, testing the words against what he'd just said, feeling the strange symmetry of it settle over the table between them. "I heard you the first time," Samuel said. "And I meant what I said the second time. My children need a mother, Miss Whitmore. I'm not fool enough to think that's a decision made over one supper. But I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought it watching you at that table tonight, and I told you already I don't have the patience left for polite lies. Not with you, not about this." Outside, the last light finally gave way to full dark, and somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked with the settling of an old structure easing into night. Clara sat across from a man she'd known less than a day, in a house that wasn't hers, in a life that had been unrecognizable to her 24 hours earlier, and found she had no answer ready for the enormity of what had just been said between them. Only the certainty, sudden and unshakable, that whatever came next in Twin Rivers, it would not be the quiet, invisible life she'd expected to live when she stepped off the stage with 11 cents and no one left in the world to call her own. Samuel didn't say anything else. He just sat there, with his hand still curled around the coffee cup, waiting the way a man waits when he's already said the thing he can't take back and doesn't know what comes next. "I should go to bed," Clara said finally. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got tonight." She stood gathering her plate, though supper had gone cold and half-eaten between them. "You said something true, Mr. Carter, and I don't intend to pretend you didn't. But I came here for wages and a roof, not for anything else, and I'd ask you to remember that in the morning, same as I intend to." "I'll remember it." Samuel rose too, and for a moment they stood on opposite sides of the small kitchen, the lamp throwing long shadows across the floor between them. "I didn't say it to trap you into anything, Miss Whitmore. I said it because it's true, and I'm done pretending things aren't true just because saying them out loud is uncomfortable." "Then we understand each other." "I doubt that very much. But we've got time to work on it." Clara carried her plate to the wash basin, and Samuel took the lamp to check the door latches, and neither of them said another word before she closed the door of her small room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, with her heart going harder than it had any right to. She told herself it was exhaustion. She told herself it was the strangeness of a new house, a new bed, a new life, folded into the space of a single day. She did not let herself examine the other explanation too closely, because examining it meant admitting that a stranger's plain, blunt honesty had rattled her more than Edward Mallory's practiced charm ever could. Morning came early the way it always did on a ranch, and Clara was up before the sun fully cleared the eastern ridge, moving through the unfamiliar kitchen by lamplight until she found flour lard and a stove that clearly hadn't been properly cleaned in longer than she cared to guess. She had biscuits in the oven and coffee on the stove by the time Samuel came through the back door, hat already on hands, already dirty from whatever chore had pulled him out before dawn. He stopped in the doorway and stared at the table like it belonged to someone else's house. "You didn't have to do all this. You hired me to cook. I'm cooking. It's not even 6 in the morning. Cattle don't wait for a decent hour, and neither does breakfast from what I understand of ranch life. Sit down before it gets cold, Mr. Carter." He sat slow, like a man testing whether a chair would hold his weight, and when he bit into the first biscuit, something crossed his face that Clara hadn't seen there before. Not quite surprise, not quite pleasure, something closer to a memory surfacing against his will. "Sarah used to make biscuits like this," he said, then seemed to catch himself, jaw tightening. "I didn't mean to say that out loud. You can say her name in this house, Mr. Carter. I'm not going to break at the mention of a woman I never knew, and pretending she didn't exist won't make either of us more comfortable. Most folks avoid the subject around me. I'm not most folks. I buried my own mother 3 weeks back. I know exactly how much good it does to have people tiptoe around the fact that someone you loved is gone." Samuel studied her over the rim of his coffee cup, and something in his posture eased by a fraction the same way it had in the wagon the evening before. "No, I don't suppose you do that particular kind of tiptoeing." Henry appeared in the doorway, hair sticking up in 6 directions, still in his nightshirt, drawn by the smell of biscuits, the way any 10-year-old boy would be. He stopped dead when he saw Clara at the stove. "You're still here." "I said I would be." "I know, He grinned sudden and wide. "I didn't think Papa would actually let you stay past breakfast. He's not real good at letting people stay." "Henry." "It's true, Papa. Aunt Ruth left after 2 days because you wouldn't stop working long enough to talk to her." "Aunt Ruth left because Aunt Ruth has opinions about how I raise my children that I don't share." Samuel reached for another biscuit. "Eat your breakfast." Molly wandered in a moment later, doll tucked under one arm, and climbed into her chair without a word. But Clara noticed the way the girl's eyes tracked her across the kitchen, cataloging, weighing the same careful attention she'd shown the day before. "Good morning, Molly." Molly considered this for a long moment before answering. "Good morning." A pause. "Are you going to make biscuits every day?" "If your father's agreeable to the wage, yes." "I'm agreeable," Samuel said around a mouthful. "Then yes, Molly, every day." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of the girl's mouth before she ducked her head back down to her plate, and Clara felt a small, unexpected warmth settle in her chest at having earned even that much. The morning unfolded in a rhythm Clara hadn't expected to find. So quickly, dishes washed, floors swept, a wash line strung between 2 posts. Behind the house, Henry trailing after her, asking questions faster than she could answer them. Molly watching from a safe distance, until curiosity finally won out, and she came close enough to help fold linens, her small hands careful and precise, in a way that suggested she'd been taught once by someone who cared whether things were done right. "Your mother taught you that fold?" Clara said, more observation than question. Molly's hands stilled. "How do you know?" "Because it's a particular way of doing it, and children don't invent particular ways of doing things on their own. Somebody showed you." "Mama used to fold laundry with me on Sundays." Molly's voice had gone very quiet. "Papa doesn't fold it right, he just balls it up." "I heard that." Samuel called from somewhere near the barn, close enough to have caught the whole exchange, and Clara found herself smiling despite everything. A real smile, the first one that had come easily since the fever took her mother on the trail. By midday, the first mini disruption arrived in the form of a rider coming up the lane at a pace that suggested urgency, and Clara's stomach tightened before she even recognized the man swinging down off his horse. It wasn't Mallory. It was a lean, weathered man with a star pinned crooked on his vest, Sheriff Coyle, who tipped his hat to Clara with obvious curiosity before turning to Samuel. "Got a wire for you from the bank in Denver, Samuel. Thought I'd bring it out myself rather than let it sit." Samuel's whole body went rigid in a way Clara hadn't seen since Mrs. Pruitt's ledger book. He took the envelope without a word, and Clara watched his jaw work as he read it. Watched the color drain slowly from his face. "Bad news?" the sheriff asked. "Nothing I can't handle." "That's not an answer, Samuel." "It's the only one I've got right now, Ray. Thank you for bringing it out." The sheriff lingered a moment, glanced between Samuel and Clara, with the particular curiosity of a small-town lawman who noticed everything and said nothing about most of it, then mounted back up and rode off without further comment. Samuel folded the letter with hands that weren't quite steady and shoved it into his coat pocket. "Mr. Carter." "It's nothing, Miss Whitmore." "You went white as a bedsheet reading a piece of paper that's nothing. It's ranch business, not yours to worry over. I understand boundaries, Mr. Carter, but I don't understand lies, and that felt considerably closer to the second than the first." Samuel looked at her for a long moment, something warring behind his eyes, and then unexpectedly some of the tension went out of his shoulders. "The bank holds a note on this land. Has since Sarah got sick, and the medicine bills piled up faster than the cattle could cover them. I've been making the payments mostly, but this last winter was hard, and I'm behind by more than I'd like to admit." "How far behind?" "Far enough that letters like that one aren't friendly reminders anymore." He didn't look at her when he said it. "I'll manage it. I always have." Always is a strong word for a man who just went pale reading a letter. "You've known me 2 days, Miss Whitmore. You don't get to diagnose my character yet." "I'm not diagnosing anything. I'm pointing out that pretending a problem isn't a problem has never once made it smaller in my experience, and my experience on that particular subject runs considerably deeper than you'd guess." Samuel exhaled long and slow, and for a moment the mask of ranch owner competence slipped just enough that Clara saw something rawer underneath exhaustion, and something close to fear quickly buried again beneath a jaw clenched tight. "I'll figure it out," he said, and walked toward the barn without waiting for a response, leaving Clara standing in the yard with a length of wet linen in her hands and a new unwelcome understanding of exactly how precarious the household she'd just joined actually was. She didn't press him further that day, though the question sat heavy in her mind through the afternoon's chores. It was Henry, predictably, who filled in the gaps nobody else would. "Papa's worried about the bank," he said that evening, helping her carry water from the well while Samuel worked late fixing a fence line by lantern light. "I heard him talking to himself in the barn last week. He does that when he thinks nobody's listening." "What does he say?" "Numbers mostly, and Mama's name sometimes. I think he blames himself that the money got so bad after she died. Like if she hadn't gotten sick, none of it would have happened. That's not how debt works, Henry. Sickness isn't anybody's fault, and neither is what it costs to try and save someone you love." "I know that. I don't think Papa knows it, though. Not really. Not in the part of him that matters." Henry set down his bucket, looking older than 10 for a moment, the way children sometimes did when grief had forced them to grow faster than they should have. He was different before, talked more, laughed even. Mama used to say he had a laugh that could scare the crows off the corn. And now, he mostly just works until he's too tired to think and goes to bed and gets up and does it again. Henry looked at her with a directness that reminded her uncomfortably of his father. You made him laugh yesterday, in the wagon. I heard it. It sounded rusty like a gate that hadn't been opened in a long time, but it was real. Clara didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't try to give one. She simply picked up her own bucket and kept walking, aware of the boy's eyes on her, aware of the strange, unearned weight of hope a 10-year-old had apparently decided to place on her shoulders after a day and a half of acquaintance. The unease from the sheriff's visit hadn't fully settled by the time Clara made her first trip into town 3 days later, sent to fetch supplies with a list in Samuel's careful handwriting and Henry along for company, at his own insistence. She hadn't expected the errand to turn into anything more than flour and coffee and a length of new rope, but Twin Rivers, she was quickly learning, rarely let anything stay simple. Mrs. Pruitt intercepted her outside the mercantile before she'd even tied off the wagon. Well, the Carter girl. I'm not the Carter girl, Mrs. Pruitt. I'm employed by Mr. Carter. Is that what we're calling it? Mrs. Pruitt's eyes flicked meaningfully toward Henry, who was already inside examining a display of penny candy with the single-minded focus only a child could manage. A single woman living alone under a widower's roof, no chaperone, no third party in the house to speak for propriety. Folks talk, Miss Whitmore. I did warn you. I recall the warning. I also recall it not being any of your concern how Mr. Carter arranges his household. It becomes the town's concern when the town has to decide what to think of you at church on Sunday. You are aware you're expected to attend, I assume. Twin Rivers isn't kind to women who skip services, and it's considerably less kind to women who skip them under circumstances such as yours. I'll be there, Mrs. Pruitt, with Mr. Carter and his children same as any family attends together. That's precisely the trouble, dear. You're not his family, not yet, and depending on how this town chooses to see it, perhaps not ever. Mrs. Pruitt's voice dropped not unkindly, this time something almost like genuine concern beneath the busybody exterior. I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to tell you plainly what you're walking into because nobody else in this town will bother, and you strike me as a woman who prefers plain truth to comfortable silence. I do prefer it. So tell me plainly then, what is it you think I'm walking into? A choice eventually. Between respectability and whatever it is you've started building out there on Carter's land. This town won't let you have both indefinitely. Sooner or later, somebody will force the question, and you'd do well to have your answer ready before that day comes, rather than after. Before Clara could respond, the mercantile door opened, and Edward Mallory stepped out onto the boardwalk, immaculate as ever, his eyes finding Clara with the particular attentiveness of a man who'd been waiting for an excuse. Miss Whitmore, what a pleasant surprise. Mr. Mallory. I understand you've taken a position at the Carter Ranch. He said it lightly, but there was something underneath the lightness, something assessing. Bold choice given the circumstances. It's honest work. I don't see what's bold about it. No, I suppose you wouldn't, not knowing the full circumstances. Mallory glanced toward Mrs. Pruitt, who suddenly discovered urgent business inside her own establishment and disappeared, leaving Clara alone with him on the boardwalk. Samuel Carter is a man drowning in debt, Miss Whitmore. I'd wager he hasn't told you the particulars. That's between Mr. Carter and his bank. It's between Mr. Carter and me, actually. I hold the note. Clara went very still. I don't understand. The bank in Denver sold the paper on his mortgage some months back to cover their own losses after a bad winter of foreclosures elsewhere in the territory. I bought it. Quietly. Samuel doesn't know yet the wire he received was from the Denver office confirming the transfer, though I doubt they explained who the new holder was in any detail. Mallory's smile hadn't changed, but something behind it had sharpened into something closer to its true shape. Which means, Miss Whitmore, that the fate of that ranch and everyone living on it currently rests rather more in my hands than in his. Why are you telling me this? Because you strike me as a practical woman, and practical women deserve to make decisions with full information. Samuel Carter has 90 days to bring his payments current before I'm entitled to call the note and take possession of the land. 90 days, Miss Whitmore, and from what I understand of his finances, he doesn't have a fraction of what he'd need. And if he doesn't have it, then the ranch becomes mine. The children lose their home, and you find yourself once again a woman with no family and now no employment either. Mallory stepped closer, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, almost reasonable. Unless, of course, someone were to intervene on the family's behalf. Someone with the means to simply make the debt disappear. You. Me. Though I confess my willingness to be generous in that direction would depend a great deal on whether the woman currently keeping his house found herself amenable to a different arrangement. With me. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach, a fury so precise it nearly stole her voice entirely. You'd hold a family's home hostage to extort a marriage proposal. I'd call it an incentive, not an extortion. Business is business. Miss Whitmore and I've simply arranged the pieces so that the most sensible outcome happens to also be the one I prefer. He tipped his hat unbothered by her expression. You needn't answer today. 90 days is a generous window. Consider it. Talk to Samuel if you like, though I'd think carefully about how much of this conversation you choose to share, given how it might affect his temperament in the meantime. He walked back into his store, leaving Clara standing on the boardwalk, with her hands shaking the list of supplies, suddenly the least important thing in the world. Henry emerged a moment later, oblivious of penny candy already half consumed. Miss Whitmore, you look like you saw a ghost. I'm fine, Henry. You don't look fine. I will be. She forced her hands, still forced her voice level, aware of how easily a 10-year-old with sharp instincts might see straight through the performance. Let's finish the shopping. Your father's waiting on that rope. But the ride back to the ranch passed in a blur she barely registered, Mallory's words circling in her head like something venomous, and by the time the ranch house came into view, Clara had made a decision she wasn't entirely sure was wise. She would tell Samuel everything, and she would tell him tonight, whatever damage the truth did to the fragile, unfamiliar peace they'd only just begun building. She found her chance after supper, once Henry and Molly had been sent off to bed protesting, and Samuel sat at the table mending a piece of tack by lamplight, his hands moving with the same steady competence he brought to everything. I need to tell you something, and I don't think you're going to like it. Samuel set down the leather strap. That's an alarming way to start a conversation. Edward Mallory bought your mortgage note from the Denver bank. He holds it now, not them. He told me himself on the boardwalk not an hour ago. The color drained from Samuel's face for the second time in 3 days, faster this time, more complete. That's not possible. The wire said... The wire confirmed a transfer. It didn't say to whom. He said the bank didn't bother explaining the particulars, and he was counting on you not finding out until it suited him to tell you. Why would he? Samuel stopped understanding, arriving visibly the way a man's face changes when a puzzle he's been avoiding suddenly assembles itself whether he wants it to or not. You. Me. He's using the note to get to you. He said if the payments aren't brought current in 90 days, he's entitled to take the land. And he said he'd be willing to make the debt disappear if I... Her voice caught, and she made herself finish it plainly, the way she'd promised herself she would. If I agreed to marry him instead. Samuel stood so fast, his chair scraped hard against the floor, and for one terrifying moment, Clara thought he might do something reckless, ride into town, and put his fist through Edward Mallory's carefully composed face. Instead, he stood there, gripping the back of the chair, knuckles white, breathing hard through his nose. He said that to you. On the street. In broad daylight. He said it very calmly, like he was discussing the weather. That son of a... Samuel caught himself glance toward the hallway where his children slept and lowered his voice with visible effort. That man has been circling this town for 2 years, looking for a way to expand his holdings, and he's decided my family's grief is the opening he's been waiting for. I told him I needed time to consider. You're not considering it. Of course I'm not considering it, Samuel. His first name came out before she'd decided to use it, and neither of them commented on the shift, though something in his expression flickered at the sound of it. But I needed him to believe I might at least long enough to give us room to think of something else. Samuel dropped back into his chair, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. The weight of 90 days and a bought-up note settling visibly onto shoulders that had already been carrying more than any one man should. I don't have 90 days worth of payments sitting anywhere, Clara. I've got cattle I can sell, but not enough. Not this time of year. Not at prices that'll cover what's owed. I've got no family to borrow from. He stopped, laughed once, bitter and short. I've got a hired woman I met 4 days ago who just walked into my kitchen and told me the man holding my children's future hostage wants to marry her to get it. We'll find another way. Will we? He looked up at her, and there was something raw and unguarded in his face that hadn't been there before, something that had stopped pretending to be composed. Because from where I'm sitting, there's a very simple way to make this entire problem disappear. And it doesn't involve me finding 90 days of back payment out of thin air. Don't. I'm not saying I want you to do it. I'm not. Don't even finish that sentence, Samuel Carter. Clara's voice came out sharper than she intended. Fury and fear tangled together into something fierce. I did not survive burying my mother on a trail with no marker to show for it, just to be handed off like collateral to the first man who decides my circumstances make me convenient to acquire. I told him no on that boardwalk, and I'll tell him no every day for the next 90, and if you so much as suggest again that my marrying that man is an acceptable solution to your banknote, I will pack my bag tonight and walk back to town on my own 2 feet. Samuel stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. Surprise, and beneath the surprise, something that looked almost like relief, like a man who'd needed someone else to say the words he hadn't trusted himself to say out loud. I wasn't suggesting it, he said quietly. I was testing whether you'd let me. That's an ugly thing to test a person with. I know, I'm sorry. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, exhausted in a way that went beyond the hour. I've spent 2 years making every decision alone. Clara, and most of those decisions have been bad ones, or at least not good enough. I don't know how to trust that someone else might actually stay and help carry something this heavy instead of running the first chance they got. Sarah would have stayed. Sarah would have fought Mallory to a standstill without blinking. I don't know yet what kind of woman you are when the fighting actually starts, and I apologize for testing it in such a poor way. You're about to find out what kind of woman I am, Mr. Carter, because I don't intend to let that man take this house out from under 2 children who've already lost one parent to something they couldn't control. Something passed between them, then wordless the particular understanding of 2 people who'd both been flattened by loss and were only now cautiously considering whether it was safe to stand back up together. Samuel reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, close enough that the space between their fingers felt charged with something neither of them was ready to name. 90 days, he said. We'll need every one of them. Then we'd best start using them wisely instead of sitting here staring at each other. That earned her the ghost of a smile, the second one she'd seen from him, and it settled something in her chest, even as the weight of Mallory's ultimatum pressed down harder than it had an hour before. The next several days passed in a strange charged rhythm. Ordinary chores layered over an extraordinary problem. Biscuits and mended fences and bath times for 2 children who had no idea their home hung by a countable number of days. While Samuel rode out each morning, trying to calculate which cattle could be sold without gutting the herd he'd need for next season, and Clara stretched every dollar of the household budget until it groaned under the strain. It was Henry who noticed first that something had shifted beneath the surface of the house. "You and Papa talk different now," he said one afternoon, watching Clara hang wash while Samuel worked the far fence line within shouting distance. "Like you're keeping a secret." "Grown-up business, Henry. Nothing for you to worry over." "That's what Papa says about everything that actually matters." Henry picked at a loose thread on his sleeve, uncharacteristically subdued. "Are we going to lose the ranch?" Clara's hand stilled on the wash line. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I heard you and Papa through my window 3 nights ago. I heard the word mortgage, and I heard you say Mallory's name, And I know what that man's like. Everyone in town knows what he's like. She considered lying, considered the easy comfort of telling a 10-year-old not to worry about things beyond his control, and found she couldn't do it. Not after everything she'd already told him about honesty being the only currency she had left to trade in. "There's a problem with money owed on this land," she said carefully. "Your father's working to fix it, so am I. It's serious. Henry and I won't pretend otherwise to you, but it isn't decided yet, and there's still time to change how it ends." "Is that why Mallory wants to marry you? To get the ranch?" Clara's breath caught. "Where did you hear that?" "I didn't hear it. I guessed it. He's been sniffing around every unmarried woman in this town for 2 years, according to Mrs. Pruitt, and now suddenly he's interested in the one woman living under our roof, right when Papa's behind on the mortgage. I'm not stupid, Miss Whitmore." "No," Clara said slowly, studying the boy with new respect. "You most certainly are not. Are you going to marry him?" "No, Henry, I am not." "Good." Henry's shoulders dropped with visible relief, some tension leaving his small frame that Clara hadn't fully registered him carrying. "Because Molly would cry for a week, and I don't think Papa would ever talk again, and I just got him talking again." "You didn't get him talking again, Henry. That's not something one person does for another. You did it. I watched it happen. You showed up 4 days ago, and now he laughs sometimes, and he eats breakfast at the table instead of standing at the stove wolfing it down before he goes out. That's you. Don't tell me it isn't because I've been watching him for 2 years, and I know the difference." Clara didn't have an answer for that, so she reached out instead and smoothed down a piece of Henry's stubborn cowlick, an old-fashioned motherly gesture that arrived before she'd consciously decided to make it, and Henry, to her surprise, didn't pull away. Sunday arrived before Clara felt ready for it. The whole household dressed in their best and loaded into the wagon for the drive into town, and she spent the entire ride with her stomach in knots, remembering Mrs. Pruitt's warning about what the congregation might make of her presence. The church was already half full by the time they arrived, and Clara felt every eye in the room track their arrival the moment Samuel led his children up the aisle with her a half step behind. Whispers rippled through the pews, not loud enough to be called rude outright, but not quiet enough to be missed either. "There she is," someone murmured. "The Carter girl. Living out there with him and no chaperone in sight. Well, what do you expect, a woman with no family showing up out of nowhere?" Samuel's jaw tightened, and Clara saw him hesitate at the end of the pew, weighing whether to sit beside her or put distance between them for the sake of appearances. Henry, apparently unbothered by any of it, simply grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her into the pew beside him, effectively deciding the seating arrangement before his father could overthink it. The service passed without incident, though Clara felt scrutinized through every hymn, every prayer, every moment. The preacher's gaze happened to sweep across the congregation. It was afterward, on the church steps, that the pressure finally found its voice. "Mr. Carter." The gray-bonneted woman from the boardwalk approached with 2 other women flanking her, expressions arranged into practiced concern. "A word, if you don't mind." "Mrs. Abernathy." Samuel's tone was carefully neutral. "This is a delicate matter, but I feel it's my Christian duty to raise it. This young woman has been living in your home for nearly 2 weeks now, unmarried, unchaperoned, with no family to speak for her reputation or yours. The Ladies' Auxiliary has discussed it, and we felt someone ought to say plainly what the whole town is already whispering." "And what exactly does the Ladies' Auxiliary propose I do about my household arrangements, Mrs. Abernathy?" Perhaps Miss Whitmore might board elsewhere in town, until such time as the arrangement could be made proper. There's a respectable boarding house 2 streets over that would suit an... "Miss Whitmore boards at my ranch because my children need looking after, and my house needs running, same as any hired hand would be housed on any ranch in this territory." Samuel's voice hadn't risen, but something in it had gone hard as flint. "Nobody in this town raised an eyebrow when I hired Cole Pruitt to bunk in my barn for 2 seasons running cattle. I fail to see why a woman doing honest domestic work in my kitchen deserves different treatment simply on account of her being a woman. It's hardly the same situation, and you know it, Samuel Carter. I know that my children have eaten better and slept easier in the last 2 weeks than they have in 2 years, and I know that Miss Whitmore has done nothing in this town but work herself half to exhaustion trying to hold a broken household together. If the ladies' auxiliary has energy to spare, worrying over my domestic arrangements, might I suggest redirecting it toward something more useful, like asking why Edward Mallory's been quietly buying up mortgage notes on struggling ranches across this county, and using them to pressure widowers into arrangements considerably less honest than the one under my own roof. A ripple of surprise went through the small crowd gathered on the steps. Mrs. Abernathy's mouth opened and closed once before she recovered her composure. "That's a serious accusation, Samuel." "It's a serious fact, Mrs. Abernathy, and I'd wager I'm not the only man in this county who could confirm it if pressed. Now, if you'll excuse us, my children have had a long morning and I intend to get them home for dinner." He herded Henry and Molly toward the wagon with a hand at each of their backs, and Clara followed, aware of the stunned silence trailing behind them. Aware, too, of something fierce and grateful blooming in her chest at having watched Samuel Carter, a man who supposedly hadn't strung more than 3 words together in 2 years, defend her in front of half the town without hesitation. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, once they were clear of the churchyard. "Yes, I did." Samuel didn't look at her, focused on the road ahead, but his voice had lost none of its earlier steel. "I've spent 2 years letting this town say whatever it wanted about me because I didn't have the energy left to argue. I've got the energy today." "Careful, Mr. Carter. If you start standing up for me in front of the whole congregation, people might start drawing conclusions. Let them draw whatever conclusions they like." He glanced at her, then something warm flickering behind the exhaustion in his eyes. "I find I care considerably less about this town's conclusions than I did 2 weeks ago." Henry, wedged between them on the bench, grinned so wide it looked like it might split his face in two, and said nothing at all, which for Henry was its own kind of remarkable restraint. 2 days after the incident at the church, Sheriff Coyle rode out to the ranch again, this time without any wire, to deliver his hat in his hands and an unusually grave expression on his weathered face. "Got a few minutes, Samuel?" "Always got a few minutes for you, Ray. Something wrong?" "Nothing wrong exactly, more something I thought you ought to know after what you said outside church Sunday." Coyle glanced at Clara, who was hanging wash within easy earshot, and seemed to decide including her in the conversation wasn't worth the trouble of asking her to leave. "You said Mallory's been buying up notes on struggling ranches. I did some asking around after that quiet-like, and it turns out you weren't exaggerating." "How many?" "3 that I could confirm outright, going back the better part of 2 years. The Hendersons lost their spread to him 18 months back. You remember they moved on to Wyoming after. Word was, Mallory offered the widow Henderson the same arrangement he seems to have offered Miss Whitmore here. She turned him down flat and lost everything within the month." Clara's hands stilled on the wash line cold, despite the summer heat. "And the others?" Samuel asked. "One family sold out before it got that far, took a loss, but kept their dignity, moved east. The third?" Coyle hesitated, glancing again at Clara. "The third was a young widow with 2 children out past the miller's place. She didn't turn him down. Married him inside of 2 months of losing her husband. I see her in town sometimes. She doesn't smile much anymore, if you take my meaning." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything the summer heat could account for. "Why are you telling me this now, Ray?" "Because you stood up in front of half this town on Sunday and said something true that most folks were too scared to say out loud, and I figure a man with that much backbone deserves to know exactly what kind of animal he's dealing with." Coyle settled his hat back on his head. "I can't arrest a man for buying legal paper and making legal proposals, Samuel, much as I might want to. Everything Mallory's done sits just inside the line of what's permitted, however rotten it smells. But I can tell you plainly, he doesn't bluff, and he doesn't stop, and he's got more patience for this particular game than any man ought to have. If you're going to beat him, you're going to need those 90 days to count for something real, not just hope. We're working on it." "Good. Because Ray Coyle can't save your ranch from a debt collector with a legal claim, no matter how much I might wish otherwise. All I can do is make sure you're walking into this fight with clear eyes." He nodded once to Clara. "Miss Whitmore, for what it's worth, standing up to that man on the boardwalk Took considerably more nerve than most folks in this town would manage. Don't let anybody make you feel foolish for it." He rode off, leaving Samuel and Clara standing in the yard with the weight of 3 ruined families settling between them like a stone dropped into still water. "He's done this before," Clara said quietly. "He's good at it. Practiced. Which means he won't stop just because we outmaneuver him on the cattle sale. No. It means we need to move faster than 90 days if we can manage it, and we need to be smarter than whatever he's planning next." Clara wrung out the shirt in her hands with more force than the task required. A man who's done this 3 times already isn't going to sit patiently through a 4th failure without adjusting his approach. Samuel's expression darkened with the particular grimness of a man realizing the fight ahead was worse than he'd already braced for. "Then we'd best ride for the Ashford spread sooner rather than later." That night, well past midnight, Clara woke to the sound of small feet in the hallway and a soft, uncertain knock at her door. She found Molly standing there in her nightgown doll clutched tight, face pale in the moonlight coming through the hall window. "Molly? What's wrong?" "Bad dream." The girl's voice was very small. "About Mama. She was calling for me and I couldn't find her, and then the floor gave out and she was gone, and I woke up and I couldn't remember what her voice sounded like anymore, and that scared me worse than the dream did." Clara knelt down, bringing herself level with the girl. "That happens sometimes when someone we love has been gone a while. The memory of their voice gets harder to hold on to, even though we don't want it to fade. It doesn't mean you loved her any less. Will I forget Papa's voice too someday if something happens to him? Nothing is happening to your Papa. You don't know that. Mama wasn't supposed to happen either, and then she did." Molly's chin trembled. "I don't want to forget anybody else's voice." Clara pulled the girl into her arms without thinking twice about it, and Molly came willingly burying her face against Clara's shoulder. Small body shaking with the particular grief of a 6-year-old confronting mortality for the 2nd time in her short life. "I'm going to tell you something my own mother told me the year my father died," Clara said quietly, rocking slightly the way she remembered being rocked. "She said grief doesn't take away the people we love. It just changes how we carry them. You won't forget your mama's voice, not the parts that matter. It'll come back to you in pieces when you least expect it. A certain smell, a certain song, a certain way, the light comes through a window in the afternoon. Those pieces add up over time into something you can hold on to, even when the exact sound of her voice gets harder to remember perfectly. Is that true, or are you just saying it because I'm crying?" The bluntness startled a small laugh out of Clara despite the moment. "It's true. I promise you it's true. I still remember the exact way my mother hummed while she kneaded bread dough, even though I sometimes struggle now to remember exactly how her laugh sounded. The pieces stay. They just rearrange themselves." Molly was quiet for the long moment, still held tight against Clara's shoulder. "Will you stay? Not just tonight. I mean, will you stay here at the ranch even after the bad money thing with Mr. Mallory is over?" Clara's throat tightened, and she was grateful the girl couldn't see her face in the dark hallway. "I intend to stay as long as your father needs me here, and as long as you and Henry want me around. I want you around." Molly pulled back just enough to look up at her small face, fierce with a conviction that seemed too large for a 6-year-old to carry alone. "You're the first person who's made Papa laugh since Mama died. Henry told me, I want you to stay forever, not just until the money problem is fixed." Forever's a long time to promise, sweetheart. Promise anyway. And though every practical instinct told Clara it was reckless to make promises to a grieving child about a future that hinged on 90 days, and a mortgage note, and a man's willingness to trust a woman he'd known less than a week, she found herself saying it anyway, quiet and certain in the dark hallway. "I promise I'll stay as long as I possibly can, Molly. That's the most honest promise I know how to give you." It seemed to be enough. Molly let herself be walked back to her own bed, tucked in with the same careful attention Clara had watched her fold laundry with days before, and fell asleep almost instantly, the particular boneless sleep of a child who'd finally set down a fear too heavy to carry alone. Clara didn't sleep again that night. She sat by the kitchen window instead, watching the moon track slowly across a sky thick with more stars than she'd ever seen back east, and turned Mallory's ultimatum over and over in her mind, searching for an angle she hadn't yet considered a solution that didn't end with either a stranger's forced marriage or a family losing everything they had left. By morning, she had an idea half-formed and possibly foolish, and she brought it to Samuel over breakfast with more confidence than she actually felt. "You said you've got cattle you could sell, but not enough to cover what's owed, not at this time of year's prices." "That's right. What if the prices weren't the problem? What if there was a buyer willing to pay above market quietly, without Mallory or the bank knowing the particulars until the deal was already done?" Samuel set down his coffee, studying her with new interest. "You know a buyer like that?" "Not yet, but I intend to find one. My father used to say, every problem in commerce comes down to finding the person who wants what you're selling more than you need to sell it. There are ranches to the north, aren't there? Bigger operations, ones that might need breeding stock rather than beef prices. There's the Ashford spread 2 days ride north. Big operation always looking to expand their herd genetics." Something sparked behind Samuel's tired eyes, the first real flicker of hope Clara had seen there since Mallory's name entered the conversation. "I hadn't thought to ask them. Never had cause to before." "Then perhaps it's time you did." Samuel was quiet for a moment, turning the idea over visibly, and then he did something that surprised them both. He reached across the table and took her hand, briefly, firmly, the first real touch between them that wasn't accidental or necessity-driven. 90 days doesn't feel quite as impossible this morning as it did 3 nights ago," he said. "I don't know if that's your doing, or the cattle idea's doing, or something else I haven't got a name for yet. But thank you, Clara, for all of it. Don't thank me yet. We haven't sold a single cow, and Mallory's still holding that note like a knife over both our heads." She squeezed his hand once before letting go, aware of Henry watching the whole exchange from the doorway with poorly concealed delight. "But I intend to see this through, Samuel Carter. Every last one of those 90 days, if that's what it takes." Outside, the summer sun was already climbing hot and bright over the ridge, promising another long day of work and worry in equal measure, and Clara allowed herself for just a moment to believe that the coming fight might actually be one they could win. The moment didn't last long. She was in the garden that afternoon, wrestling weeds from around the tomato plants, when the sound of an unfamiliar carriage, too fine for a ranch road, too polished for anyone but Edward Mallory, came rattling up the lane. Clara straightened, wiping dirt from her hands, and felt her stomach drop the instant she recognized him driving it himself alone, no clerk or witness in sight. "Miss Whitmore?" He climbed down without waiting for an invitation, surveying the ranch yard with the appraising eye of a man calculating what it would fetch at auction. "Samuel isn't here, I take it?" "He's out with the herd. I'd suggest you come back when he is, rather than trespass on land that still belongs to him." "Still belongs to him, for now." Mallory smiled, and it was a colder thing than any smile she'd seen from him before. "I heard an interesting rumor in town this morning. Something about a buyer up at the Ashford spread, and cattle prices well above market. I confess I'm curious how a man 3 months behind on his mortgage payments suddenly found the wherewithal to arrange such favorable terms. I don't see how that's your concern, provided the payments arrive on schedule. Everything about this ranch is my concern, Miss Whitmore. That's rather the point of holding the note." He stepped closer, and Clara held her ground, refusing to give him the satisfaction of retreating. "I also heard about Sunday. Quite the performance on the church steps, from what several parishioners described to me. Samuel Carter, finding his voice again, defending your honor in front of half the county, naming me by name as though I'd done something shameful rather than simply sound business. You extorted a marriage proposal out of a family's desperation. I'd call that considerably worse than shameful. I'd call it opportunity properly recognized. Words matter less than outcomes in my experience." Mallory's jaw tightened, the first crack Clara had seen in his composure. "I don't appreciate being named a villain from a church pulpit, Miss Whitmore, even indirectly. It complicates business relationships I've spent years cultivating in this town. Then perhaps you should reconsider the business you're conducting. Or perhaps I should reconsider the timeline." His voice went soft, almost pleasant, which made the words that followed land considerably harder. 90 days was a generous window offered in good faith before Samuel Carter decided to publicly humiliate me in front of the entire congregation. I find my patience for generosity has thinned considerably since Sunday. 30 days, Miss Whitmore. That's what remains now. 30 days to bring the note current in full, or I take possession of this land and everyone on it finds somewhere else to live before the first snow falls. Clara's blood ran cold. You can't simply change the terms because your feelings were hurt. I can do precisely that, actually. The note specifies I'm entitled to call it whenever I judge the risk of continued default to have increased, and a very public accusation of predatory conduct made by the debtor himself strikes me as exactly the kind of reputational risk that would concern any reasonable lender. Mallory climbed back into his carriage, entirely unbothered, straightening his coat as though the conversation had been nothing more than a pleasant social call. You may relay the new terms to Samuel yourself, Miss Whitmore, or I can return this evening and deliver them personally. Either way, the arithmetic remains the same. 30 days, or the Carter Ranch belongs to me, and everyone currently living on it will need to find somewhere else to call home before winter. He snapped the reins and pulled the carriage around, leaving Clara standing frozen in the garden with dirt still under her fingernails, and 30 days now standing between the Carter family and everything they had left in the world. She was still standing there unmoving when Samuel rode in an hour later and took one look at her face before swinging down from his horse without bothering to tie it off properly. What happened? Mallory was here. What did he say? Clara made herself meet his eyes, made herself deliver the words plainly, the way she'd promised herself she always would with him, however much it cost either of them to hear it. He's cutting the timeline to 30 days, Samuel. He says the church accusation gave him legal grounds to call it early. 30 days, or he takes the ranch. Samuel didn't say a word for a long moment. He just stood there in the yard, one hand still gripping the reins of his horse, staring at nothing in particular, while the weight of 30 days settled into the lines of his face. 30 days. That's what he said. That's not enough time to drive cattle to the Ashford spread, negotiate a price, and get payment back here before the deadline. 2 days there, 2 days back at minimum. And that's assuming Ashford agrees to terms on the spot without wanting time to inspect the herd first. Then we don't have time to waste standing in this yard talking about how little time we have. Samuel looked at her, something sharpening behind his exhaustion. You're right. Get me a list of what needs doing here while I'm gone. I'll leave at first light. You're not going alone. Clara, somebody has to stay with Henry and Molly, and it's not going to be me riding north while my children sit here unsupervised. I didn't say I was coming with you. I said, you're not going alone, in the sense that matters. You need someone at your back who isn't exhausted and half sick with worry before you've even started riding. Take one of the hands from the Miller place. Tom Miller owes you a favor, doesn't he? Samuel blinked, some of the tension in his jaw easing at the practicality of it. He does, actually, from the fence work last spring. Then call it in. You'll need a second man to help drive the cattle regardless, and better it's someone you trust than someone you're paying by the day who might talk too loose in the wrong company. You've thought about this more than I have in the last 5 minutes. I've had 5 minutes longer to think about it than you have since I was the one standing here when Mallory delivered the news. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, forcing her voice steady, despite the fear still curdling in her stomach. Go talk to Tom Miller tonight. I'll have everything ready here by morning. Samuel nodded once, decisive. Now some of the old competence Clara imagined he'd carried before grief hollowed him out, returning to his posture. He mounted his horse without another word and rode toward the Miller spread at a pace that suggested he understood exactly how little margin 30 days actually left them. Henry found her in the kitchen an hour later, having clearly overheard enough of the earlier conversation to piece together the shape of the crisis, even if he didn't have every detail. Papa's leaving. For a few days. He's going to sell cattle to a rancher up north. To pay off Mallory. To pay off the mortgage, yes. Henry sat down heavily at the table, looking older than his 10 years in a way that made Clara's chest ache. What if he doesn't make it back in time? What if something happens to him on the road, and then we lose the ranch and Papa too? Nothing is going to happen to your father, Henry. You don't know that. You said that before about Mama not being supposed to happen, and then Molly's mama happened anyway. He caught himself. Our mama. I mean, our mama. Clara knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. I can't promise you nothing bad will ever happen again, Henry. That would be a lie, and I don't lie to you. But I can promise you that your father is one of the most capable men I've met, and Tom Miller's riding with him, and 30 days is enough time if everyone does their part carefully. Your part right now is helping me keep this house running while he's gone. Can you do that? Henry straightened visibly, steadying himself around the responsibility she'd handed him. Yes, ma'am. Good, because Molly's going to need you steady even if you don't feel steady yourself. That's what older brothers are for. Is that what you did for your mother before she— I was the only child. Nobody to be steady for but myself. Clara squeezed his hands once. Which is exactly why I know how much it helps to have somebody else in the house who isn't falling apart even when everything else is. Samuel left before dawn the next morning, a hurried, awkward goodbye at the kitchen door that ended with him pausing halfway down the porch steps, turning back like he'd meant to say something else, and thought better of it. Watch the place, he said instead. And watch yourself. If Mallory comes around again, I can handle Edward Mallory. I know you can. I still don't like leaving you to handle him alone. You're not leaving me alone. You're leaving me with 2 children who need looking after and a house that needs running same as you hired me for. Go sell your cattle, Samuel. We'll be here when you get back. He held her gaze a moment longer than the conversation strictly required something unspoken passing between them. And then he mounted up and rode north with Tom Miller falling in beside him, the dust of their departure hanging in the still morning air long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded. The first 2 days passed in careful, deliberate routine chores, done meals cooked. Henry and Molly kept busy enough that the fear didn't have room to fully take hold. It was the 3rd day with no word from Samuel, and the deadline shrinking by the hour, that trouble found its way back to the ranch in the form of Edward Mallory's carriage rattling up the lane once more. Clara met him in the yard before he'd even fully stepped down, unwilling to let him closer to the house than necessary. Mr. Carter isn't here. I'm aware. Word travels fast in a town this size, Miss Whitmore. Everyone knows Samuel Carter rode north with cattle 3 days ago, presumably hoping to outrun the arithmetic I explained to you. Mallory's smile carried none of its earlier warmth, sharpened now into something closer to its true ugly shape. I thought you should know as a courtesy that I sent a wire ahead to the Ashford spread yesterday. Clara's stomach dropped. What kind of wire? Simply informing them of Samuel's financial situation, his debts, the precariousness of his position. I thought it only fair that any potential buyer understand exactly what kind of desperation they'd be negotiating against before agreeing to terms. Mallory examined his gloves with studied casualness. Desperate men rarely get fair prices, Miss Whitmore. Any experienced buyer knows to press an advantage when one presents itself so plainly. You sabotaged the sale. I clarified the circumstances. There's a difference. There isn't, and you know there isn't. Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides, fury burning hotter than fear for the first time since this whole nightmare began. You're terrified he might actually succeed, so you're doing everything in your power to make certain he can't. Something flickered behind Mallory's composed expression, not quite alarm, but close enough to it that Clara understood with sudden clarity that she'd struck closer to the truth than he wanted acknowledged. I'm protecting an investment, he said, voice tightening. Nothing more. You're a coward hiding behind paperwork because you know you couldn't win a fair fight. The words landed harder than she'd intended, and for just a moment, something raw and furious cracked through Mallory's carefully maintained veneer. Careful, Miss Whitmore. I've been remarkably patient with you, given how thoroughly you've insulted me at every opportunity since we met. That patience has limits. Are you threatening me? I'm reminding you of the arithmetic. 27 days remain. If Samuel returns from Ashford with nothing or with a price undercut by the information I've provided, this land becomes mine regardless of how many insults you've hurled at me in the meantime. He climbed back into his carriage, jaw-tight composure only partially reassembled. You might consider in the time remaining whether pride is truly worth the cost you're about to pay for it." He drove off before she could respond, and Clara stood in the yard shaking, not entirely from fear this time. Fury had crowded in alongside it. Fierce and unfamiliar. The particular rage of watching someone deliberately sabotage a family's last hope out of nothing more than wounded vanity and greed. Henry had watched the entire exchange from the porch, and when Clara turned, his face was pale. "He sabotaged Papa's deal. I don't know for certain yet. We won't know until your father gets back. That's why he's not back yet. Something went wrong up there, didn't it?" Clara didn't have an honest answer that wouldn't frighten him further, so she said nothing, and the silence stretched long enough that Henry understood it as confirmation regardless. Samuel returned on the 5th day, dust-covered and grim. Tom Miller riding beside him with an expression that told the story before either man said a word. Clara met them in the yard, heart-hammering, searching Samuel's face for some sign of the outcome. "Well, Ashford knew everything before we even arrived." Samuel dismounted heavily, moving like a man who'd aged years in 5 days. "Every detail of the mortgage, the timeline, the fact that I'm desperate to sell before a deadline. Somebody made certain of that. Mallory. Had to be. Nobody else knew the particulars." Samuel's jaw worked, fury and exhaustion tangled together. "Ashford offered half of what the cattle were worth, half Clara, because he knew I couldn't afford to walk away and try elsewhere with the clock running out." "Did you take it?" "I had to. Half of something is better than all of nothing, and I didn't have time left to shop the herd around to another buyer." Samuel pulled a folded bank draft from his coat, holding it out like it weighed considerably more than paper should. "It's not enough, Clara. Even with everything I had saved, besides, it's not enough to bring the note current. We're still short. Considerably short." The words hit harder than Clara expected. Some fragile hope she hadn't realized she was still carrying crumbling all at once. How short? Almost $400 short. Might as well be $4,000 for all the difference it makes. "I don't have it, and I don't know where I'd find it in 25 days. Molly appeared in the doorway, just in time to hear the number, her small face crumpling with the particular fear of a child, who understood even without fully grasping the arithmetic that something terrible was about to happen to the only home she remembered. "Are we going to lose the ranch?" Nobody answered right away, and the silence was its own kind of confirmation, heavier than any words could have been. "Papa," Molly's voice cracked. "Are we?" Samuel crossed the yard and crouched down to her level, exhaustion and fear visibly warring with the need to steady his daughter. "I'm going to do everything I possibly can to make sure that doesn't happen, Molly. I promise you that." That's not the same as saying no. 6 years old, and already she understood the difference between a promise to try and a promise of certainty. Samuel had no answer for that kind of clarity. And Clara watched him struggle to find words that wouldn't feel like a lie, watched the toll of the last 5 days catch up to him all at once, in the slump of his shoulders. That night, after the children had finally been coaxed to sleep, despite their fear, Clara found Samuel sitting alone on the porch steps in the dark, the bank draft still crumpled in one fist. $400, he said, not looking up as she sat beside him. "I've spent 2 years telling myself I was managing, that I was keeping this family afloat well enough, and it turns out I was one bad winter and one greedy man away from losing everything the whole time. That's not a failure, Samuel. That's just what happens when grief and debt pile up faster than one person can outrun them. Sarah would have found the $400. She always knew how to stretch what we had further than I ever could. Sarah isn't here, and comparing yourself to a memory isn't going to conjure $400 out of the dark." Clara's voice came out sharper than she intended, though not unkindly. "What matters now is what we do with the 25 days we've got left, not what a dead woman might have managed differently." Samuel flinched at the bluntness, but something in his expression suggested he needed exactly that. Needed someone unwilling to let him drown in comparison and self-pity when there was still time left to fight. "You're right," he said finally. "What do we do?" "I've been thinking about it since you left. There's a way, but you're not going to like it. At this point, Clara, I'll consider anything short of handing you over to that man. I want to write to my cousin in California, Samuel looked at her confusion, cutting through the exhaustion. I thought you had no way to reach him. No address, no certainty he'd even respond. I don't have a current address, no. But I know the name of his store, and I know the town, and a letter addressed plainly enough might find him even without the particulars. It's a gamble, and it would take weeks to get any response, even if it worked, which is longer than we have. She took a breath, steadying herself for what came next. But I also have something else. My mother's ring. It's not worth $400 outright, but combined with what you've already got from the cattle sale, it might close enough of the gap that a bank in Denver would extend different terms, or that another lender might buy out the note from Mallory before he can call it. Clara, no. That ring is the only thing you have left of her. It's a ring, Samuel. It's gold, and a small stone, and a memory, and none of those things keep two children in the only home they've ever known. Her voice wavered despite her best effort to keep it steady. I've already lost my mother. I'm not losing this family too. Not when I've got something in my possession that might help save it. I won't let you sell it. You don't get to decide that. It's mine to sell, and I've already made up my mind. They sat in tense silence for a long moment, the argument hanging unresolved between them, until Samuel finally exhaled and dropped his head into his hands. I hate this, he said muffled. I hate that the only options left to us involve you giving up something precious or me watching my children lose their home. I hate that I couldn't manage this on my own, and I hate that Mallory's greed has backed an entire family into choosing between two kinds of loss. Then let's find a third option instead of hating the two bad ones we've already got. Samuel lifted his head, something in his exhausted expression sharpening with sudden attention. What third option? I don't know yet, but we've got 25 days a ring, whatever's left from the cattle sale, and two people who refuse to simply accept defeat without exhausting every possibility first. That's not nothing, Samuel. That's considerably more than most people facing this exact situation would have. He studied her for a long moment in the darkness. Something shifting behind his eyes that had nothing to do with money or mortgages or ticking clocks. You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met. I've been told that before, usually as an insult. I don't mean it as one. His voice had gone quiet rough with something Clara hadn't heard from him before. I mean it as the truest thing I know about you, and possibly the reason my children are sleeping soundly tonight instead of crying themselves sick with fear. The air between them shifted, charged with something neither of them had acknowledged directly since that first night at the kitchen table. Clara felt her pulse quicken, felt the careful distance she'd maintained since arriving begin to feel considerably harder to hold on to. Samuel. I know. Employer and employee. Wages and a roof, nothing else. He said it without bitterness, almost gently. I'm not going to push past that line, Clara. I gave you my word the first night, and I meant it. But I'd be lying if I said watching you fight for this family the way you have this past week hasn't changed something in me that I don't fully know how to name yet. Clara's throat tightened, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the porch dark and quiet around them. The weight of 25 days and everything at stake pressing down and somehow impossibly feeling lighter for having someone to carry it alongside. We should sleep, she said finally, though she made no move to stand. Tomorrow we ride into town. I'll sell the ring. You'll see what the bank will actually say about the balance. We keep fighting one day at a time until we run out of days or run out of options, whichever comes first. And if we run out of both, then we'll have lost knowing we tried everything instead of losing because we gave up early out of fear of what trying might cost us. She stood brushing off her skirt, aware of him watching her in the dark. Get some sleep, Samuel. 25 days isn't much, but it's not nothing either, and I intend to use every hour of it. The trip into town the next morning carried a grim determination that even Henry and Molly seemed to sense, riding quiet in the back of the wagon, while their father and Clara sat rigid on the bench seat, neither speaking much, both braced for whatever the day might bring. The jeweler examined Clara's mother's ring with a loop screwed into one eye, turning it slowly under the lamp on his counter, and named a figure that fell considerably short of what she'd hoped. It's a fine piece, miss, but the stone's smaller than it looks, and the gold's not pure enough to fetch top price. I could offer you $60, perhaps $65, if you're willing to haggle. $65. a fraction of what they needed, and still Clara felt something tear loose in her chest at the thought of handing over the only physical piece of her mother she had left for a sum that wouldn't even come close to solving the problem. "I'll take 65, she said before she could talk herself out of it. Samuel's hand closed over hers on the counter, stopping her. "Clara, it's my decision, Samuel. I know it is. I'm not stopping you from making it. I just want you to be certain, because once that ring is gone, it's gone, and $65 isn't going to close a $400 gap, regardless of how badly we both wish it would." Clara hesitated, hand still resting beneath his, the jeweler waiting with poorly concealed impatience for a decision either way. "You're right," she said, finally pulling her hand back and closing her fist around the ring instead of pushing it across the counter. $65 isn't enough to matter, and I won't have sold the last thing I own of my mother's for a sum that changes nothing in the end. The jeweler shrugged unbothered and returned to whatever task her arrival had interrupted. Outside, the summer heat pressed down as heavily as it had the day Clara first arrived in Twin Rivers, and she found herself standing on the same boardwalk, facing the same impossible arithmetic, with considerably less hope than she'd carried even a week before. "We need a bigger solution," Samuel said, staring down the street toward the bank. $65 from a ring, whatever's left from half-priced cattle, none of it adds up to enough. We need something we haven't thought of yet. It was Sheriff Coyle emerging from the jailhouse across the street, who unknowingly handed them exactly that. "Samuel, Miss Whitmore." He tipped his hat, taking in their grim expressions with obvious concern. "Bad news from Ashford, I take it. Word travels. Half price on the herd thanks to somebody's helpful telegram." Samuel said, bitterness sharp in his voice. "Mallory." Coyle's jaw tightened. "I figured as much soon as I heard the price Ashford paid. Man's gotten bold since Sunday, thinking nobody in this town has the stomach to call him out directly." "Bold enough to sabotage a fair deal out of spite," Clara said. "Is there truly nothing that can be done about a man using legal paper to destroy families this way?" Coyle considered the question longer than Clara expected, something calculating entering his weathered expression. "Legally, no, not directly. But there's more than one bank in this territory, Miss Whitmore, and more than one way to skin a debt. Have you considered whether another lender might be willing to buy out Mallory's note entirely, take the debt off his hands before he can call it? Banks compete for good land, same as anybody else competes for anything valuable. And Carter land isn't worthless whatever, Mallory's telegram to Ashford might have implied." Samuel went very still. "You think a bank would actually do that? Buy out a note that's already in default territory? I think it's worth writing to Pueblo and asking, rather than assuming the answer's no before you've tried. There's a banker there, name of Whitfield, does business straight and fair, no games. He might see value in land that Mallory's been artificially depressing the reputation of, especially if he understood the full circumstances of how that reputation got depressed in the first place." Something sparked in Samuel's exhausted face, the first real hope Clara had seen there since he'd ridden back from Ashford defeated. "Pueblo's a full day's ride each direction. Then you'd best leave today if you mean to make use of the days you've got left." Coyle tipped his hat again. "I can't do much about Edward Mallory's paperwork, Samuel, but I can tell you where the fight might still be winnable, and I figured that was worth more to you right now than sympathy." He walked on, leaving Samuel and Clara standing on the boardwalk with something that felt cautiously, dangerously like renewed hope. "Pueblo," Samuel said. "Today." "Today," Clara agreed. "I'll manage the children and the house. You ride for Pueblo and find this Whitfield before Mallory finds some new way to close off every door we manage to open." Samuel turned to look at her, something fierce and grateful passing across his face. "I don't know how to thank you for any of this, Clara. The idea about Ashford standing your ground against Mallory, refusing to give up on a ring that meant everything to you. You can thank me by riding to Pueblo and coming back with good news, instead of standing here wasting daylight on gratitude." That earned her the ghost of a smile, tired but real, and within the hour Samuel was mounted and riding south with fresh urgency, leaving Clara once again to hold the household together while the countdown continued, 24 days remaining, and every single one of them now feeling like it mattered more than the last. Samuel reached Pueblo well after dark, the ride harder and longer than he'd anticipated. his horse lathered and his own body aching in ways that had nothing to do with the miles covered. He found the bank closed for the night and spent an uneasy few hours in a rented room turning over every argument he might need to make Whitfield understand why a stranger's ranch was worth the risk. Morning brought him to the bank's door before it had properly opened, and Whitfield, when he finally appeared, proved to be a stout, unhurried man who listened to Samuel's entire story without interruption, hands folded on his desk, expression giving nothing away. "You're asking me to purchase a note that's currently held by a man with every legal right to call it in 23 days, Whitfield said once Samuel had finished. "A note on land that a competitor has apparently gone to considerable trouble to make appear worthless to potential buyers. I'm asking you to purchase a note on land that produces some of the best grazing in this county, currently being deliberately undervalued by a man using dishonest tactics to force a personal advantage that has nothing to do with sound business. That's a serious accusation. It's a documented fact if you're willing to send someone to ask around Twin Rivers, 3 families before mine. Ask the Sheriff Ray Coyle. Ask the widow Henderson if you can find her in Wyoming. Edward Mallory doesn't compete for land, Mr. Whitfield. He manufactures desperation and then profits from it." Whitfield studied him for a long moment, something calculating behind his steady gaze. "And what exactly would you offer me in exchange for taking on a debt currently sitting in default territory?" "Fair interest paid on time, same as I managed for 2 years before this last winter got away from me. And land that's worth considerably more than Mallory's telegram to Ashford implied, which I can prove with a walk of the property whenever you'd care to make the trip. That's a significant risk on my part. Mr. Carter, based entirely on your word and a reputation I have no way of verifying from behind this desk." "Then send someone to verify it. I don't have unlimited days left to convince you, Mr. Whitfield, but I've got enough left to wait while you check every fact I've given you, provided you're willing to move quickly once you have." Whitfield leaned back in his chair, studying Samuel with new interest. Something in the younger man's steady, exhausted determination, apparently registering as more convincing than the words alone. "I'll send a man to Twin Rivers this week. If everything checks out the way you claim, I'll consider purchasing the note at a fair valuation, and I'll extend you terms that don't hinge on a stranger's personal grievance against you." "Consider isn't a guarantee. No, it isn't. But it's considerably better than the alternative you rode a full day to avoid, and I'd suggest you take it rather than pushing for more certainty than any reasonable banker would offer a man he met an hour ago." Whitfield extended a hand, and Samuel shook it, feeling something loosen in his chest for the first time since Mallory's carriage had rattled up his lane weeks ago. "Go home, Mr. Carter. Tend your land. My man will find you within the week." Samuel rode back toward Twin Rivers with something that felt dangerously close to hope, though he forced himself to temper it with the knowledge that consider wasn't the same as certain, and a week of waiting still left precious little margin against a deadline that continued shrinking with every passing hour. It was late that same evening, with the children finally settled and the house quiet around her, that Clara heard hoofbeats approaching the ranch far sooner than Samuel could possibly have returned from Pueblo. Her stomach clenched with instant instinctive dread even before she recognized Edward Mallory's silhouette dismounting in the moonlit yard alone. No carriage this time, just a man on horseback who'd clearly ridden out under cover of darkness for reasons that couldn't be good. She met him at the door rather than let him any closer to the sleeping children inside. "It's late, Mr. Mallory. I'd suggest whatever business you think you have here can wait for daylight." "I heard Samuel rode for Pueblo." Mallory's voice had lost its earlier smoothness, something rawer and more desperate bleeding through the composed exterior. "To see Whitfield, I presume, about buying out my note." "I don't see how that's any of your concern, provided the payments." "It is entirely my concern, Miss Whitmore, because if Whitfield agrees to purchase that debt, I lose my leverage entirely, and 2 years of careful patient work evaporate in a single afternoon." His hands were clenched at his sides, and for the first time since Clara had met him, Edward Mallory looked less like a calculating predator and more like a man watching his carefully constructed plan collapse in real time. "I've put considerable resources into acquiring that note. I don't intend to simply watch it slip away because a hired woman decided to be resourceful. Then perhaps you shouldn't have built your entire scheme on the assumption that desperate people never find a way to fight back. 24 days, Miss Whitmore. 24 days, and I am done being patient, done being reasonable, done watching this town celebrate Samuel Carter as some kind of wronged hero while I'm painted the villain for engaging in perfectly legal business. Something dangerous entered his voice, quiet and controlled in a way that frightened Clara more than any shouting could have. I am prepared to make you one final offer tonight before Samuel returns and complicates matters further with whatever arrangement he thinks he's negotiating in Pueblo. Marry me. Tomorrow, if a preacher can be found quickly enough. I will personally guarantee the note is satisfied in full. The Carter family keeps their home, and this entire ugly business ends immediately cleanly, with everyone reasonably satisfied except perhaps your own pride. And if I refuse, then I will do everything in my considerable power to ensure Whitfield never agrees to purchase that note. I will call the debt the moment those 24 days expire, and I will make absolutely certain that every person in this territory knows exactly whose stubbornness cost 2 children their home. Mallory stepped closer, moonlight catching the hard, desperate glint in his eyes. I am not a patient man by nature, Miss Whitmore, whatever performance of patience I've managed until now. You would do well to consider that before you refuse me again. Clara stood her ground, every instinct screaming at her to retreat, and refused to give him the satisfaction. I refused you the first time on a boardwalk with witnesses nearby, Mr. Mallory. I'm going to refuse you again right now, alone in the dark, because my answer doesn't change based on how frightened you're trying to make me. I will not marry a man who tried to destroy a family's home in order to force my hand. Whatever happens with Whitfield, whatever happens with your note, the answer is no. It has always been no. It will remain no. Mallory's composure cracked entirely, then fury and desperation twisting his features into something ugly and unguarded. You foolish, stubborn girl. Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? Not just for yourself, for that entire family. 2 children about to lose everything they have left because you'd rather cling to some romantic notion about a man who can't even provide for his own household without a hired woman's help. Get off this land, Mr. Mallory. This land will be mine within the month regardless of what you decide tonight. Get off this land now before I wake Henry and have him fetch the shotgun from the barn, because I promise you that boy would relish the excuse. Something in her voice must have finally convinced him she meant it, because Mallory backed toward his horse, still furious, still radiating the particular danger of a man watching his plans unravel and searching desperately for some way to salvage them. 24 days, Miss Whitmore. Enjoy them. They're the last peaceful ones you or that family are going to have for quite some time. He rode off into the dark, leaving Clara shaking on the porch steps. Adrenaline and fury and fear tangled together so completely she could barely separate one from another. She stood there a long while after the hoofbeats faded, staring out at the empty yard, understanding with sudden, sickening clarity that Edward Mallory was no longer simply a greedy businessman pursuing an advantageous arrangement. He was a desperate man who had just revealed exactly how far he might be willing to go. And 24 days suddenly felt like nowhere near enough time to prepare for whatever came next. Samuel returned late the following afternoon, dust-caked and saddle-sore, but carrying himself with a cautious optimism Clara hadn't seen since before the bank's first letter arrived. He found her waiting on the porch, and the moment he took in her face, whatever good news he'd been preparing to share died on his lips. What happened? Mallory came here last night, alone, after dark. Samuel was off his horse before it had fully stopped closing the distance between them in a few long strides. Did he touch you, threaten the children? He threatened me. Not the children directly, though he made it plain enough what happens to them if I keep refusing him. Clara made herself recount it plainly, every ugly detail, watching Samuel's face darken with each sentence until his hands had curled into fists at his sides. He offered marriage again tonight instead of tomorrow, said he'd guarantee the note satisfied if I agreed before you got back, and in his words, complicated matters further. And you told him no. I told him no. I told him to get off this land before I woke Henry to fetch the shotgun. Something between fury and fierce pride crossed Samuel's face at that, though the fury clearly won out a moment later. He came here at night alone and threatened you while I was 3 counties away trying to save this family's home. I should ride into town right now, and you should do no such thing, because riding into town in a rage tonight accomplishes nothing except possibly landing you in Ray Coyle's jail for assault, which helps exactly no one. Clara caught his arm before he could turn back toward his horse. Samuel, look at me. I am unharmed. I am angry and frightened, and I haven't slept, but I am unharmed. And what we need right now is a plan, not a fistfight that gives Mallory an excuse to call the note early on grounds of your own bad conduct. The reasoning landed visibly, some of the reckless fury draining out of Samuel's posture, even as the anger remained banked beneath the surface. How did he seem truly? You know him better than I do, having borne the worst of his attention. Desperate. More desperate than I've seen him. He said if Whitfield buys the note, 2 years of careful work evaporate for him. And he sounded like a man watching everything slip away, rather than a man calmly executing a plan. Clara studied Samuel's exhausted, dust-covered face. What happened in Pueblo? Whitfield sending a man to Twin Rivers this week to verify everything I told him. If it checks out, he'll consider buying the note at fair value. Samuel exhaled hard. Consider, not promise. And a week is a considerable chunk of the 23 days we've got left, especially now that we know Mallory's willing to show up here alone in the dark when he's frightened enough. Then we don't have the luxury of simply waiting quietly for Whitfield's man to arrive. No, Samuel agreed, something grim and determined settling into his voice. We don't. Henry appeared in the doorway just then, having clearly been listening from somewhere within earshot, his face pale in the lamplight spilling out onto the porch. Mallory came here while Papa was gone. He did, Clara said, seeing no point in softening it now that the boy had already heard enough to piece together the truth. I sent him away. Everyone's safe. He shouldn't be allowed near this house. Henry's voice shook fear and fury tangled together in a way that reminded Clara painfully of his father. What if he comes back? What if next time you're not fast enough to send him off? Henry. Samuel crouched to his son's level hands, steady on the boy's shoulders, despite everything roiling beneath his own composed exterior. I'm not leaving this ranch again until this is settled. Not for Pueblo, not for Ashford, not for anything. You have my word. You said the bankman needs a week to check things out. That's a whole week Mallory could try something else. Then we make that week count for something more than waiting. Clara said, an idea sharpening in her mind, even as she spoke it aloud. Samuel Sheriff Coyle mentioned the widow Henderson out in Wyoming. If she'd be willing to put her account in writing everything Mallory did to her, everything that cost her family their home, that's exactly the kind of proof Whitfield's man could use to move faster, instead of simply verifying land value and reputation in the abstract. Wyoming's a long way to send a letter and expect a fast answer. Then we send a telegram instead of a letter, and we ask Ray Coyle to help track down her current address through whatever lawman's network exists between here and there. It's not certain, but it's considerably better than sitting here counting days and hoping Mallory doesn't find some new way to make things worse before Whitfield's man arrives. Samuel looked at her for a long moment, something like wonder mixed in with the exhaustion on his face. You never stop finding another angle, do you? Not when the alternative is watching 2 children lose the only home they've ever known. No, I don't stop. They rode into town together the next morning, all 4 of them. Henry and Molly tucked safely between them on the wagon bench and found Sheriff Coyle willing enough to help once Samuel explained the reasoning, though his expression turned grave when he heard about Mallory's nighttime visit to the ranch. That's considerably more reckless than anything I've seen from him before, Coyle said, jaw tight. A man that desperate is a man worth watching closely. I'll send the wire to Wyoming myself today, see if I can't track down where the Hendersons settled. Thank you, Ray. Don't thank me yet. 22 days isn't much time for a telegram to find someone, get a written account back, and have it reach Whitfield's man before he's already made up his mind based on whatever he finds here in town. Coyle's expression darkened further. And there's something else you both should know since I heard it myself not an hour ago from the county clerk. Clara's stomach tightened. What? Mallory filed papers yesterday afternoon, requesting an emergency hearing before the county judge, arguing the notes already effectively in default, given how far behind the payments have run, and that further delay only increases his risk of loss. Coyle's voice was grim. If the judge grants it, that hearing could happen inside of 2 weeks, Samuel, regardless of whatever deadline you thought you still had left. The words landed like a physical blow. Samuel went very still beside her, and Clara felt the ground shift beneath everything they'd been fighting, for the careful, hard-won progress of the last several days, suddenly rendered meaningless by a single piece of paper filed in a courthouse. None of them had thought to watch closely enough. "He's trying to end this before Whitfield's man even arrives," Samuel said, voice hollow. "That's exactly what he's trying to do," Coyle confirmed. "And unless something changes fast, Samuel, I don't know that there's anything standing between you and a judge's ruling in Mallory's favor inside of 2 weeks' time." 2 weeks. Samuel repeated the words hollow in his mouth. 2 weeks to prove 3 years of predatory dealings to a judge who's probably never met Edward Mallory outside of whatever donations he's made to the man's re-election campaign. "Then we use every single one of those days, like they're the last we've got," Clara said, though her own voice shook with the effort of sounding steadier than she felt. "Ray, when's Whitfield's man due?" "Wednesday, if the wire I sent this morning reaches him in time to move up his schedule." "That's 4 days before the hearing if the judge sets it for the earliest date the law allows. Then we'd best hope Whitfield's man works fast, and hope even harder that Wyoming answers that telegram before the courthouse doors open." Coyle's jaw was tight. "I'll ride out myself if I have to, Samuel. Nobody in this county wants to watch Mallory get away with what he's done to your family and 3 others before you." The 4 days that followed passed in a blur of frantic, exhausting motion. Whitfield's man arriving Tuesday instead of Wednesday, walking the property with a surveyor's eye that missed nothing, asking pointed questions of Sheriff Coyle and 3 separate neighbors who'd watched Samuel work himself half to death, holding the ranch together. By the time he left, his expression had shifted from cautious skepticism to something considerably closer to conviction. "Mr. Whitfield will want to see this himself," he told Samuel on his way out. "But between us, Mr. Carter, I don't think you've got much to worry about on the land's value. Whatever Mallory told Ashford was a lie, built on nothing." The telegram from Wyoming arrived the following morning, 2 days before the hearing, and Clara's hands trembled, reading it aloud on the porch, while Samuel listened with his jaw clenched tight enough to ache. The widow Henderson had written 3 full pages unflinching, in every ugly detail, the note bought quietly, the marriage proposal disguised as rescue, the swift and total ruin that followed her refusal. She'd signed it with a hand that hadn't wavered once, and added a single line at the bottom that made Clara's throat close entirely. "Don't let him win this time. Somebody finally needs to stop him." "That's it," Samuel said quietly. "That's everything Coyle needs to bring before the judge. It's everything we need. Whether it's enough depends on whether that judge cares more about the law than whatever debt he might owe Mallory for past favors." Samuel reached over and took her hand steady, this time no hesitation in it at all. "We'll find out together." The night before the hearing, Henry couldn't sleep, and Clara found him sitting at the kitchen table well past midnight, turning the widow Henderson's letter over in his hands like he could will more certainty out of the pages by staring at them hard enough. "What if it's not enough?" he asked, not looking up. "What if the judge doesn't care, and Mallory wins anyway, and everything we did these past weeks was for nothing? Then we'll have lost knowing we fought as hard as anyone possibly could have, Henry. That matters even if it doesn't feel like enough tonight." "That's not really an answer." "No," Clara admitted, sitting down across from him. "It isn't. I don't have a better one to give you, not tonight, not with so much still uncertain. But I can tell you that your father rode to Pueblo on faith alone, and Sheriff Coyle chased down a telegram across 2 territories, and a widow in Wyoming, who owes this family nothing, wrote 3 pages of her own pain because she wanted to stop Mallory from doing to us what he did to her. That's not nothing, Henry. That's about as much as anyone could ask the world to give us. Henry considered that for a long moment, then folded the letter carefully and slid it back across the table. "I'm coming to the hearing tomorrow. So is Molly. We should be there, whatever happens." "Your father might say you're too young." "Papa's stopped treating me like I'm too young for things that matter." "You did that, I think, same as everything else." The courthouse was packed the morning of the hearing. Half the town crowded into benches that had clearly never seen this much attention paid to a mortgage dispute before. Mallory sat at his table, looking composed, immaculate, entirely unbothered by the crowd, until Sheriff Coyle rose and read the widow Henderson's letter into the record word by devastating word, and something in Mallory's careful posture began visibly to crack. "Objection," Mallory's lawyer said, standing too fast. "This letter is hearsay unverified, written by a woman with an obvious grudge against my client." "The grudge," Judge Reyes said dryly, not looking up from the pages in front of him, "appears to stem from your client buying her mortgage and proposing marriage as a condition of forgiving the debt. I'd call that motive considerably more troubling than the letter itself, Counselor." A ripple of murmurs swept the courtroom. Mallory's face had gone rigid, all his easy charm evaporated into something tight and furious. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something urgent, and the lawyer rose again, visibly reluctant. "Your Honor, even setting the letter aside, my client maintains this is purely a business matter, and the court has no grounds to interfere with a lawfully executed note, simply because Mr. Carter has found sympathetic testimony from a disgruntled former debtor." "Your Honor," he said, rising himself now, voice carefully controlled, despite the fury Clara could see simmering beneath it. "Whatever occurred with the Henderson matter, this case concerns the Carter note specifically, and the fact remains that Mr. Carter is significantly behind on payments, regardless of my personal conduct, which is precisely why Judge Reyes said, 'I've been informed a Mr. Whitfield of Pueblo is prepared to purchase this note in full at fair market value, effective immediately, provided this court doesn't grant your emergency motion first.'" He glanced toward the back of the courtroom, where a stout man in a dark coat had risen at the mention of his name. "Mr. Whitfield, I presume. I am your Honor, and I can confirm the offer stands verified and ready to close today if the court permits it." Mallory's composure finally shattered entirely. "This is outrageous. A coordinated effort to strip me of a legally acquired asset. An asset acquired through a documented pattern of predatory lending disguised as legitimate business, if the Henderson letter and Sheriff Coyle's testimony are to be believed," Judge Reyes said, setting down his pen with an air of finality. "I'm satisfied they should be believed. This court denies the emergency motion. Mr. Carter, you're free to sell your note to Mr. Whitfield on whatever terms you two negotiate. Mr. Mallory, I'd strongly advise against attempting this particular business strategy again in my county." The gavel came down, and the courtroom erupted into murmurs and a few scattered claps that Judge Reyes silenced with a single stern look, though he didn't seem entirely displeased by the reaction. Clara felt the breath she'd been holding for weeks finally leave her body all at once, and beside her, Samuel sat frozen for a long moment before something like disbelief broke across his exhausted face. "It's over," he said, barely a whisper. "Clara, it's actually over." "It's over," she confirmed, and then he was pulling her into his arms, right there in the crowded courtroom, in front of half the town, in front of Henry and Molly, who'd been watching from the front row with matching expressions of stunned hope. And Clara let herself be held without a single thought toward propriety or wages, or the careful distance she'd sworn to maintain since her first night in his kitchen. Mallory brushed past them on his way out, face like a thundercloud, and paused just long enough to speak low and venomous, meant for Clara alone. "This isn't finished." "Yes, it is," Clara said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "It's been finished since the moment you decided threatening a woman in the dark was an acceptable business strategy. Get used to losing, Mr. Mallory. This town isn't going to forget what you tried to do here." He said nothing further, simply walked out into the sunlight with what remained of his dignity, and Clara turned back to find Samuel watching her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, something unguarded, something that had stopped pretending to be merely grateful. They celebrated that evening with a supper considerably finer than their usual fare. Henry recounting the entire courtroom scene for anyone who'd listen, with the dramatic embellishment only a triumphant 10-year-old could manage. Molly finally fully relaxed for the first time in weeks, laughing at her brother's exaggerations until she nearly fell out of her chair. It was later, after the children had gone to bed exhausted and happy, that Samuel found Clara on the porch, the same steps where they'd sat through so many hard conversations these past weeks, and settled beside her without a word. "I owe you everything," he said finally. "This ranch, my children's home, whatever peace I've got left in me after 2 years of barely holding on. None of it survives without you. You fought just as hard as I did, Samuel. Don't diminish what you did riding to Pueblo, standing up in that church, refusing to give up when every practical instinct told you the fight was already lost. Maybe. But I wouldn't have had the fight left in me at all if you hadn't walked into this town 3 weeks ago with 11 cents and more stubbornness than any woman I've ever met." He turned to face her fully, something raw and certain in his expression that hadn't been there before. "I told you once that my children needed a mother. I want to tell you something different tonight, something considerably more honest. I need you, Clara. Not as hired help, not as someone convenient who happened to save my family. I need you the way a man needs the one person who made him remember how to feel something besides grief." Clara's breath caught her heart hammering against her ribs in a way that had nothing to do with fear for the first time in weeks. "Samuel, I'm not finished." His hand found hers in the dark, steady and sure. "I don't have a ring to offer you tonight, and I know it's too soon by every proper measure this town would judge us by. But I'm done pretending I don't love you, Clara Whitmore. And I'd rather say it plainly tonight than spend one more day being careful with words that deserve to be said honestly. I love you too." Clara said the words arriving easier than she'd expected, true and certain, in a way that settled something deep in her chest that had been unsteady since the day her mother died on the trail. "I have for longer than I probably should admit, given how impractical and reckless it's been to fall in love with a man I was hired to cook for." Samuel laughed, real and warm, the sound of a man who'd finally set down a weight he'd carried for 2 long years. "Then perhaps we'll simply have to be reckless together going forward. Perhaps we will." Clara leaned into him, feeling his arm come around her shoulders with the same steady certainty he brought to everything that mattered. 21 days of that particular nightmare, and not one of them was easy. But I wouldn't trade a single day of it, Samuel Carter, not if it means ending up exactly here. Above them, the summer stars spread thick and bright across the Colorado sky. And for the first time since she'd stepped off the stage into Twin Rivers with nothing left in the world but 11 cents and her own stubborn will to survive. Clara Whitmore let herself believe fully, and without reservation, that she had finally found the family she thought she'd lost forever on that trail beside her mother's unmarked grave. The weeks that followed passed with a lightness Clara hadn't allowed herself to imagine possible, back when 11 cents had been the whole of her fortune. Whitfield's papers arrived within days, the note transferred clean and simple payments, restructured into terms that no longer felt like a countdown toward disaster. Samuel worked the herd with something like joy again, whistling under his breath, in a way Henry swore he hadn't heard since before their mother died, and Clara found herself humming over the stove some mornings without quite noticing she'd started. It was Molly who noticed first that something more had shifted between the 2 adults in the house, watching them with her usual sharp, quiet attention, until curiosity finally overcame restraint one evening at supper. "Are you going to marry Papa?" Samuel nearly choked on his coffee. Clara felt heat rush to her face, though she made herself answer honestly the way she'd promised this family she always would. "Your father hasn't asked me yet, Molly." "Why not?" Molly turned her full attention on Samuel, unblinking. "You said you loved her. Henry told me. I heard you both on the porch." "Molly." Samuel's voice carried equal parts embarrassment and helpless affection. "That was a private conversation." "You were loud." Henry snorted into his own plate, badly disguising a laugh, and Clara pressed her napkin to her mouth to keep from doing the same. Samuel looked between his 2 children, caught entirely, and finally set down his fork with the resigned expression of a man who'd just realized his careful timeline had been rendered irrelevant by a 6-year-old's bluntness. "Fine," he said. "I suppose there's no sense waiting for a private moment that clearly isn't coming." He rose from the table, crossed to where Clara sat frozen with her own fork halfway to her mouth, and knelt beside her chair in front of both his children. No ceremony to it at all, beyond the plain, unguarded certainty in his face. "Clara Whitmore, I had a whole speech planned for some quiet evening on the porch moonlight, and all the trimmings a woman like you probably deserves. My daughter's apparently decided that evening isn't happening on its own schedule, so I'll ask you here instead, plain in front of the two people who love you nearly as much as I do." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, simple gold, clearly not new. "This was my mother's. I've been carrying it around for a week, trying to find the right moment, and I'm beginning to understand there isn't one, so I'm making this the moment instead. Marry me. Not because my children need a mother, though God knows they do, and not because you saved this ranch, though you did that too. Marry me because I love you, because I can't imagine another morning in this house without you in it, and because I'd rather spend the rest of my life being reckless alongside you than careful and lonely without you." Clara's hands were shaking, tears blurring her vision before she'd even fully processed the words. "Yes," she said, the answer arriving before any hesitation could catch up to it. "Yes, Samuel Carter. I'll marry you." Molly let out a shriek of pure delight loud enough to startle the dog on the porch, and Henry, apparently done pretending composure, whooped and nearly upended his chair, scrambling around the table to throw his arms around both of them at once. "I knew it," he announced, muffled against Clara's shoulder. "I knew it the first day when you caught Molly falling off the wagon bench. I told Molly you were going to stay forever." "You did not tell me that," Molly protested, though she was laughing too hard to sound genuinely offended. "You said maybe." "I said definitely. You're remembering wrong because you were 6 and easily confused." "I'm still 6. Barely." Samuel laughed, the sound full and easy in a way that filled the whole kitchen, and Clara looked around at the three of them. This family she'd stumbled into with nothing but 11 cents and a stubborn refusal to give up, and felt something settle into place inside her chest that had been unsteady since the day she buried her mother on the trail with no marker to show for it. News of the engagement reached Twin Rivers faster than Clara could have imagined possible, and she braced herself the following Sunday for whatever fresh judgment the congregation might have waiting on the church steps. Instead, Mrs. Abernathy approached first, lips pressed thin, clearly working herself up to something. "I understand. Congratulations are in order." "They are." Clara kept her voice even, unwilling to assume warmth where she hadn't yet earned proof of it. "I'll admit, Miss Whitmore, I judged your circumstances rather harshly when you first arrived. A woman with no family living unchaperoned under a widower's roof, it looked exactly like the kind of trouble this town warns its daughters against." Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened by a fraction, grudging but genuine. "I was wrong. Watching what you did for that family standing against a man half this town was too frightened to name outright that took more character than I gave you credit for. I hope you'll accept my apology along with my congratulations." "I accept both, Mrs. Abernathy. Thank you." Even Mrs. Pruitt, cornering her near the mercantile later that same day, offered something that might have been the closest thing to warmth the woman's brusque nature could manage. $4, she said without preamble. "That's what Samuel Carter paid to settle your debt the day you arrived in this town. I remember thinking he'd lost his senses throwing money at a stranger like that." She shook her head, something almost fond flickering across her sharp features. "Turns out, it was the best $4 that man ever spent. I'll expect an invitation to the wedding. Miss Whitmore and I intend to bring a cake, whether you ask for one or not." The wedding took place 3 weeks later. Small and simple, held in the same church, where half the town had once whispered about her arrival with such suspicion. Mrs. Pruitt, true to her word, brought a cake she'd baked herself, muttering something about how she supposed the girl had turned out steadier than she'd first appeared. Mrs. Abernathy sat stiffly in a back pew, though even she offered a tight, genuine smile when the preacher pronounced them married. Sheriff Coyle stood near the door, the entire ceremony arms crossed, looking as satisfied as Clara had ever seen him, as though watching Edward Mallory's careful scheme collapse into a wedding he could attend was its own particular kind of justice. Mallory himself had left Twin Rivers within a month of the hearing, selling his mercantile at a considerable loss, and moving on to some other territory where his particular talents for manufactured desperation hadn't yet worn thin. Nobody in town mourned his absence, and Clara found she thought of him rarely. The fear he'd once inspired, shrinking smaller with every passing week until it barely registered as more than a bad memory from a harder time. Molly wore a new dress for the wedding, insisted upon walking down the aisle, scattering flower petals with the solemn seriousness of a girl who understood exactly how important her job was. And Henry stood beside his father as the closest thing to a best man a 10-year-old could manage, beaming through the entire ceremony without a trace of his old caution. It was that evening back at the ranch, with the last of the wedding guests finally gone and the house settling into quiet, that Molly climbed into Clara's lap on the porch swing, still in her flower-petaled dress, drowsy and content in the way children get after a long day full of excitement. "Can I call you Mama now?" she asked, voice already half claimed by sleep. "Since you're really staying forever now, officially." Clara's throat tightened, the word landing somewhere deep and permanent in her chest. "I would like that very much, Molly." "Good." The girl burrowed closer, eyes already closing. "Because I've been wanting to call you that for weeks, but Henry said I should wait until it was official, so nobody would think I was rushing you." Henry sounds like a very wise young man. He's annoying, but sometimes he's right. Molly's voice had gone soft and slow with sleep. "Good night, Mama." The word hung in the summer air between them, simple and enormous all at once, and Clara held the sleeping girl close, looking up to find Samuel watching from the doorway with an expression that told her he'd heard every word. He crossed to sit beside her on the swing, careful not to jostle Molly. And Henry appeared a moment later, settling on the porch steps below them, with the easy comfort of a boy who'd finally fully stopped bracing for the next disaster. 12 weeks ago, Samuel said quietly, watching the last of the summer light fade over the ridge. "I was a man who'd forgotten how to feel much of anything, except tired and afraid for his children's future. 12 weeks, and here we are." "Here we are," Clara agreed, Molly's small weight warm and solid against her chest. Henry's shoulder leaning back against her knee, Samuel's hand finding hers on the worn wood of the swing between them. A family built out of a stranger's 11 cents and a boy's blunt question on a boardwalk in Twin Rivers. "The best family I could have ever asked for," Samuel said, and there was no hesitation in it, no careful measuring of words the way there had been that first night in his kitchen. Just certainty, plain and unshakable as the Colorado ground beneath their home. By the time autumn settled over the ranch, the house had transformed in ways that went beyond the whitewashed porch and mended fences Clara had promised herself she'd tackle that first evening. Henry had taken to calling her Mama too, tentatively at first, and then, without a second thought, the word arriving naturally in the middle of ordinary sentences about chores and horses and whatever mischief he and Molly had gotten into that day. Samuel laughed easily now, the rusty, unused sound from those early weeks worn smooth into something that filled the house at least once every day, usually at Henry's expense, or Molly's insistence, on some new elaborate story involving her doll. The bank payments arrived on schedule every month, ordinary and unremarkable, in a way that still occasionally struck Clara as a small miracle after the desperate arithmetic of that first summer. Whitfield himself rode out once to see the property he'd taken such a risk purchasing, and left satisfied enough to shake Samuel's hand twice before departing, calling it the soundest investment he'd made all year. Word came through Sheriff Coyle some months later that Edward Mallory had tried his particular brand of manufactured desperation on a young widow 2 counties over, and found himself run out of that town within a week by a sheriff who'd heard through channels nobody could quite trace exactly what kind of man he really was. Clara felt no satisfaction in his continued ruin, only a quiet relief that whatever damage he might still manage elsewhere, he'd never again find purchase in Twin Rivers, where an entire town now stood ready to recognize him for exactly what he was. Above them, the last light of another Colorado summer settled gold and quiet over the ranch that had very nearly been lost over the two children who had found, against every reasonable expectation, a mother willing to stay through the worst of it and remain for all of the best that followed, and over the man and woman who had built out of grief and desperation and 11 stubborn cents a home that no banker, no scheme, and no amount of manufactured misfortune would ever again be strong enough to take from them.